Chapter 563. Has it already reached such a stage? Lu Chen asked Old Ma. Old Ma said, maybe I'm thinking too much. After all, nothing has happened, and no one really hurt me. But if it's possible, why don't I leave Immortal City for a period of time? Lu Chen was startled. He looked at Old Ma and said, you want to leave too? Old Ma scratched his head and said, I'm just going out to relax and get some fresh air. I'll be back after a while. Lu Chen stared at him for a long time. He suddenly sighed and said, looks like you really haven't slept well for a long time. Old Ma's smile was gone. He just shrugged and said, it's good that you know. Lu Chen thought about it and said, I don't object to you leaving. But I'll say it again. Since we've entered the Immortal City's Vanity Fair and under the influence of power, some things are not up to us to decide. Now that everyone knows that you're my man, and the most trusted one at that, if you leave Immortal City rashly, you'll naturally be targeted. There will also be people who suspect that you're not avoiding trouble, but that I've sent you to do some secret things. Old Ma's face looked a little bitter. Lu Chen said again, you're also an old man in Fuyunji. I won't say these words, but I'm sure you know in your heart. With Fuyunji's power, once you're targeted by them, I'm afraid it'll be very difficult for you to leave Immortal City and live a carefree life. Old Ma gritted his teeth. He probably weighed the pros and cons in his heart. Then, he revealed a dejected expression and said, I think I probably can't escape, unless someone asks. When he said this, he stopped himself. His face revealed some apprehension as he glanced at Lu Chen. Lu Chen understood his meaning in that glance. He understood in his heart, but he did not feel too happy. His face still looked very calm, perhaps even a little dull. The person who could speak was not Lu Chen. Lu Chen knew this very well. He knew that he could not control Fuyunji. Of course, he could not order Fuyunji to let Old Ma go. Out of all the living beings in the world, only one person could do this. Both he and Old Ma knew who this person was. Both Old Ma and he knew very well who could speak in front of that person. He just stood there quietly and looked at him for a while, then nodded and said softly, wait here for a while, I'll go in and talk to that damn Baldy. After that, he turned around and strode towards the Kunlun Temple. Old Ma stood where he was, watching Lu Chen's back as he gradually walked further and further away. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of desolation in his heart. He bowed his head slightly, then sighed. There were thousands of people in the world, and everyone's fate was different. Perhaps some people were born perfect and would have a good life, but some people were unlucky, born lonely, and would always encounter all kinds of misfortunes. What kind of person would you be? Would you feel lonely occasionally? If in this long life, those who know familiar and important people, they will sooner or later leave, leaving you alone, then, how will you feel? But no matter what, probably, maybe, we would not say it, pretend to be calm, pretend to face life calmly. When Lu Chen walked into the temple, he felt a sense of loss. It was not until Old Ma's hesitant words that he suddenly realized that he only had one friend left by his side. And now, that person seemed to be about to leave. He looked up and caught sight of perfected Lord Tianlan. That burly man had a handsome and resolute face and a big bald head that was incompatible with the image of the world's experts, but it did not weaken his power at all. He just sat there quietly. He did not sit on the high lotus throne, nor did he sit on those spacious, comfortable, and majestic big chairs with backrests. He sat cross-legged on the ground, his loose robe hanging down, like a god sitting peacefully in the mortal world, like a mountain overlooking the human world. There was no one around him. In the towering and magnificent temple, there was actually no one who could accompany him. It was empty and silent. Looking at this damn bald head, Lu Chen suddenly felt that he also seemed a little lonely for a moment. Perfected Lord Tianlan originally sat there quietly with his eyes fixed on an unknown place, as if he was daydreaming. However, when Lu Chen walked in, he seemed to wake up in an instant. His eyes swept to the entrance of the temple, and then he revealed a smile that Lu Chen was familiar with. He waved at him from afar and said, "Come here." Whenever there was an important occasion or when there were outsiders present, Lu Chen and perfected Lord Tianlan would be very well-behaved and well-behaved. However, when there was no one around and the two of them were alone, Lu Chen would often become very casual, and perfected Lord Tianlan did not seem to care about it. He had always liked and even indulged his disciple, Lu Chen. There were times when many of his subordinates were puzzled by this love and affection. Some even found it hard to believe, such as Blood Warbler, Fu Yunxi, and even Old Ma. And perhaps, Lu Chen himself. Lu Chen walked straight to perfected Lord Tianlan and did not stop until he was a few feet away from him. Smiling, perfected Lord Tianlan pointed to the ground and said gently, "Sit down." Looking at his body, Lu Chen suddenly had a somewhat nasty guess. He thought, could it be that this damn bald head is too fat and heavy, and the chair will collapse if he sits on it? That's why he likes to sit on the ground. Of course, this idea was simply nonsense and not worth refuting. Even Lu Chen did not believe it at all. As a dignified perfected lord of the divine transformation realm, there was nothing he couldn't do. Why would he have such concerns? However, Lu Chen seemed to have some irrepressible impulse or an inexplicable feeling in his heart today. He just liked to think this way. Of course, on the surface, he still sat down very calmly. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. When he was about to say something, he glanced at Lu Chen's calm face and suddenly paused. Then, a trace of surprise flashed across his face, but he changed his tone and asked, "What's wrong? You seem to be in a bad mood today." Although Lu Chen had long known that the damned Baldy was omnipotent and almost omnipotent, he still felt as if he could see through people's minds with just a glance. Lu Chen still felt his heart churning. Then, he suddenly felt a little annoyed. Instead of answering perfected Lord Tianlan's question, he frowned and asked, "Hey, can I ask you something?" Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows, but with some curiosity and a faint smile, he said indifferently, "Sure, go ahead." Just as he straightened his back and sorted out his emotions, ready to answer his closest disciple, who was also his most rebellious person, and what kind of strange, inexplicable, or even earth-shattering question he heard Lu Chen say, "How have you been recently?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment. At that moment, his mood was very complicated. It should be noted that he had been prepared to face difficulties and even thought about how he should respond when Lu Chen asked all kinds of tricky and difficult questions and even his deepest secrets. However, he did not expect that he would hear such an ordinary question. "How have you been recently?" Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and looked a little displeased. But suddenly, his eyes flickered. How could he be so easily fooled given his intellect, his unparalleled wisdom, and his astounding talent and strategy? How could this question be so simple? Perfected Lord Tianlan calmed down and thought about it carefully. Then, he asked Lu Chen cautiously, "What did you mean by the standard of living well?" Lu Chen was speechless and dumbfounded. Chapter 564. It took Lu Chen quite a while to calm himself down. Then, he carefully considered his words. In the end, he said to perfected Lord Tianlan with some uncertainty and a bit of a probing tone, "Perhaps, you're having a good time recently? Do you feel very happy?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment. Then, he realized that he had probably overreacted. This rebellious disciple of his did not seem to have any weird thoughts just now. Instead, he had asked the most ordinary question. He had thought too much. The atmosphere was a little awkward. However, there was a saying that true experts did not have awkwardness. Even if they did, they could throw it to others. Therefore, perfected Lord Tianlan said very calmly, "Oh, that should be okay." "Okay? You mean that you're having a good time and are very happy?" Lu Chen actually asked again. Perfected Lord Tianlan was a little impatient. However, he always seemed to have a special endurance when facing Lu Chen. Therefore, he actually thought about it again. As a result, he actually thought about it for quite a while, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. After a while, he frowned and said to Lu Chen seriously, "I didn't think so at first." However, now that you've asked me this question, I think I really don't feel that kind of especially comfortable and happy feeling. Perhaps I'm just living my life peacefully. He nodded and said to Lu Chen, it seems that I'm not having a good time. Lu Chen rolled his eyes. The indescribable anger that had been surging in his heart suddenly disappeared at this moment. He only felt a little helpless. Shaking his head, he sighed and said, forget it, I won't talk about it anymore. Why did you call me here? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with interest. Well, I did call you here because I have something important to tell you. Lu Chen's expression turned serious. He also sat up a little straighter and his expression became serious. Unexpectedly, Perfected Lord Tianlan continued, but let's put that aside first. Tell me, why did you suddenly come in and ask that question? Lu Chen was stunned. Didn't you say that you had something important to tell me? Yeah. If it's urgent, then why didn't you say it? You actually asked me that boring question just now. Perfected Lord Tianlan said disapprovingly, no matter how important it is, I can handle it. What's there to be afraid of? Come. I see that you are a little strange today. You are very different from your usual self. This is very rare. Tell me about it. Towards the end, he seemed to be overflowing with interest. Looking at the damn baldy in front of him, Lu Chen suddenly had a strange feeling of absurdity. Could it be that this damn baldy really, also felt lonely? Thinking back, he was usually so high and mighty that it was impossible for anyone to get close to him. Only he, who had always been rebellious, could casually say a few words to him. Lu Chen didn't think about it anymore. After a moment of silence, he said, it's nothing. I just feel that life has been boring recently. Sometimes, I don't even have someone to talk to. Maybe I feel lonely. Perfected Lord Tianlan glared at Lu Chen, causing Lu Chen to feel goosebumps. He could not help but ask angrily, what are you staring at me for? Suddenly, Perfected Lord Tianlan burst into laughter and pointed at him. To think that you would have such a melancholic moment. What a joke, what a joke. Lu Chen rolled his eyes. He couldn't be bothered to argue, so he didn't say a word. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed for a while before smiling at Lu Chen. Don't talk nonsense. Back then, you hid in a fiend cult for 10 years. Back then, was there anyone who could tell you the truth? Didn't you still survive just like that? Lu Chen thought for a moment. You're right. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled. Right? Lu Chen replied, it's probably because I've experienced it that I'm especially afraid of living those days again. Perfected Lord Tianlan's smile faded slightly. A moment later, he asked softly, are you still blaming me? Lu Chen shook his head. No, I'm just expressing my feelings. I don't dare to say it in front of others, but I'm just complaining in front of you. Is that all right? Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled. It's fine, it's fine. Lu Chen sighed. These days are unbearable. It's as though I'm always seeing people leaving and dying. By the way, damned baldy, you're often alone as well. Have you ever felt lonely? Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and shook his head. Just as he was about to reply, he froze all of a sudden and fell silent. For a moment, he was speechless. Lu Chen sensed something and looked up in surprise. He saw that the smile on Perfected Lord Tianlan's face was gone and he gradually regained his original solemn expression. He was like a god and did not seem to have the emotions and desires of a human. Was he lonely? Apart from himself, no one knew the answer to that question because he was the only one who could experience that feeling. Therefore, if Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything, Lu Chen would not understand how he felt. Even though he had many guesses from Perfected Lord Tianlan's expressions and actions, they were ultimately just guesses. However, for some reason, Lu Chen suddenly felt that this damned baldy was more pleasing to the eye. When Perfected Lord Tianlan retracted his smile and was solemn, he was rather dignified and everyone on Sky Dragon Mountain respected him. However, When he saw Lu Chen looking at him with a strange expression, he frowned. Then, he suddenly said with some dissatisfaction, "What are you looking at with shifty eyes?" Lu Chen said, "Is it wrong for me to look at you and listen to you?" Perfected Lord Tianlan scoffed. "I'm a soul formation perfected lord. Is it wrong for me to say that you're wrong?" Lu Chen was stunned for a while before nodding. "You're right, it's all my fault." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and the serious expression on his face suddenly disappeared. He laughed and slapped his knee. "You're quite sensible." Lu Chen rolled his eyes, and then he sighed and said, "All right, the two of us have some status on Heavenly Dragon Mountain at any rate. What exactly do you want to talk to me about after we've wasted so much time talking nonsense?" Perfected Lord Tianlan scoffed. "You're the one who started all this nonsense. However, this is good. I'm in a good mood after talking about it. I feel like I'm living a happy life now." Lu Chen was speechless. He thought that no one would expect such a perfected Lord Tianlan to be like this. However, seeing that the damn Baldy was just sitting there happily without any intention to continue talking, Lu Chen could only remind him to talk about business again. Perfected Lord Tianlan replied with an, "Oh," as if he was reminded of that matter. He said casually, "I called you here to ask you, what have you been doing recently?" Lu Chen said, "I didn't do much. The devil cult's side is basically fine. Only Elder Ghost escaped, so I helped Shuang chase after him. Don't bother about that matter." Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly interrupted him. "Don't interfere in this matter in the future. Leave it to Shuang." Lu Chen was stunned. It was not that he was reluctant to give up that bit of power, but he was surprised that Perfected Lord Tianlan was so resolute. After a pause, he did not ask for the reason and agreed immediately. "All right." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression relaxed when he saw Lu Chen's reaction. He smiled and nodded. "All right, that's all. You can go now." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. "That's all?" "Yes, that's all. That's all." Lu Chen said. "All right, but I still have something to tell you." Chapter 565. What's the matter? Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "There's still some trouble in the Western Land. I want old Ma to go there." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and looked at Lu Chen without saying anything, but his eyes were deep and sharp as if he wanted to see through Lu Chen's mind. Lu Chen didn't intend to avoid his eyes and just met his eyes. After a while, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly snorted and said, "No." Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but then stopped. In the end, he just nodded without saying anything, and there was no shame or anger on his face after his request was rejected. When Lu Chen walked out of the Kunlun Palace, the moment he stepped out of the door, his originally calm face was replaced by a heavy graveness, as if he had a lot on his mind. Old Ma, who had been waiting outside, came to greet him. First, he carefully looked at Lu Chen's expression, and his heart skipped a beat. Then, he looked at the magnificent palace behind Lu Chen and asked in a low voice, "How is it?" Lu Chen shook his head slightly and didn't answer. He only said softly, "Let's walk and talk." Old Ma was stunned and nodded in agreement. Then, he followed Lu Chen and left the Kunlun Palace. After walking for more than 100 feet, Lu Chen stopped and said to Old Ma, "You can't leave without my agreement." Old Ma looked disappointed, but he didn't look particularly surprised. Maybe he already knew it. But even so, he still sighed and muttered a sentence. Lu Chen didn't hear him clearly and didn't know if he was complaining. After a while, Old Ma gradually calmed down and asked Lu Chen with a frown, "Why?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "No reason." He didn't explain. He just said no directly. Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Then forget it. Nothing will happen here in the Immortal City. Even if the sky falls, there are so many people on Mount Tianlong to support it." Lu Chen laughed and patted his old friend's shoulder, saying, "You're right. Don't be afraid. If something really happens, there are people more unfortunate than you. Old Ma shrugged and didn't seem to take Lu Chen's words to heart. He looked around casually and suddenly changed the topic, saying, by the way, why didn't I see Atsu today? Isn't it always with you? Lu Chen said with an, oh, and said, didn't the oxen on Kunlun Mountain also come here? Recently, Atsu often follows it when it has nothing to do. I don't know where it is now, the atmosphere on the mountain recently feels a little strange. An aged but calm voice floated in the quiet room. That hand that already seemed a bit withered was currently placed on a smooth, spotlessly white, and exquisite woman's back, gently caressing it. Song Wenji turned sideways and faced the inside of the wall. The flush on her face had mostly faded, and the remaining blush was like two groups of rouge smeared on her charming and beautiful cheeks, exuding a breathtaking temptation. But she seemed to have no intention of showing this beauty to others. She was only pretending to be tired and quietly looking at the cold and hard wall in front of her. At this time, her face revealed a rare trace of coldness. The old hand touched her bare shoulder and gently rubbed it. It was like a piece of hard and rough sandpaper, making Song Wenji's whole body tremble slightly. Her heart felt numb, and a trace of deep and dark disgust flashed across the depths of her eyes. The hand suddenly stopped, and then the voice paused for a moment. Then, with a trace of concern, he asked her, what's wrong? The coldness on Song Wenji's face vanished in an instant and was replaced by a languid coquettishness with a little shyness. She gently turned over and smiled like a blooming spring flower, beautiful beyond words. She said, I'm fine, foster father. Of course, the person behind her was Immortal Tiehu from the Hall of Heavenly Law. With some affection, he gently stroked Song Wenji's beautiful hair. His face showed a gratified expression and said, it's good that you're fine. Song Wenji smiled and said, I was distracted just now. Ifu, what did you say just now? Immortal Tiehu said, I said that recently, I feel that the atmosphere here on the mountain is a little strange. I always feel that something is going to happen. He hesitated for a moment and said, oh yes, I heard that in the Starry Hall, Feng Zhe was scolded and punished by that old man Gu Yu and has been kneeling outside the hall for a few days. Song Wenji nodded and said, it's true. I also heard about it and specially sent people to inquire about it in private. But now everyone in the Starry Hall says that Feng Zhe, for some reason, suddenly angered Immortal Gu Yu and was then punished severely by Immortal Gu Yu. He did not care about senior brother Feng Zhe's face at all. You should know that senior brother Feng Zhe is the eldest disciple of Immortal Gu Yu and is usually the most valued. Everyone thinks that he is the most promising person to inherit Immortal Gu Yu's mantle. Immortal Tiehu snorted and said, it's hard to say whether he can become Gu Yu's true disciple and take over the foundation of the Starry Hall. But with old Gu Yu suddenly doing this, it's hard to say whether he is targeting our Heavenly Law Hall. Song Wenji frowned and said, it can't be. Immortal Tiehu thought for a while and seemed to have no clue, so he changed the topic and said, that kid from the Kunlun party called Hee, has there been any progress recently? Song Wenji's eyes flashed and said, that person is in a hurry and kept asking me to make arrangements. He wants to meet you personally. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, have you checked his background? Is there anything suspicious? Song Wenji quickly nodded and said, I have. This Hee is indeed a direct disciple of the Kunlun party and is also one of the most outstanding people in the younger generation of the Kunlun party in the past few years. But a few years ago, after the chaos of the full moon in the Kunlun party, his teacher Dukhan Jinren died accidentally. Although he quickly went to Immortal Tianlan's side, I heard that he spared no effort in doing things for Immortal Tianlan. But until now, I haven't heard that Immortal Tianlan really has the intention to promote him. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, he's just a clown. What kind of person is Tianlan, why would he like him? Song Wenji raised her eyebrows slightly. Then, foster father, are you saying that he's depressed because he can't get what he wants? That's why he's secretly relying on us. Immortal Tiehu thought for a moment and said, it has been difficult for us to get a nail in Fuyunji and the Kunlun party. Although we can't completely trust Hee this time, it is a rare opportunity after all. How about this? He suddenly sat up and squinted his eyes with a hint of coldness and said, "Let him prepare a proof of allegiance. If he is sincere, I will meet him and guarantee him a bright future." Proof of allegiance? What is it? Song Wenji's eyes flashed and asked in a low voice. Immortal Tiehu sneered and said, "He naturally knows." Chapter 566. Indeed, Atsu did not follow Lu Chen for the past few days. In the eyes of the black dog, it was usually protecting this good-for-nothing. At the same time, it took some of its favorite monster meat from Lu Chen's hands or the mysterious tree hole as a form of reward. Of course, the most important thing was that Lu Chen had protected it back then. It was Sir Atsu who cherished old friendships that led it to protect Lu Chen. However, even though Atsu's strength had greatly increased after its transformation into a holy beast, it had to admit that although Lu Chen did not seem to have changed much on the surface, he gave off a different vibe than before. It was probably a very intimidating vibe. Ordinary people, even people like Old Ma, who were close to Lu Chen, would not notice this. It was only in front of Atsu that Lu Chen would sometimes let down his guard a little and reveal that slightly terrifying aura. Atsu was no stranger to that kind of aura. It had felt that murderous aura several times before. On some nights when it woke up in the middle of the night, it would suddenly feel that Lu Chen and itself were two burning flames, dark, blazing flames. That kind of aura was very dangerous. If it got too close, it might be sucked into it and burned to pieces. It was terrifying. However, Atsu was not afraid of this, because it felt that its connection with Lu Chen had become closer. However, occasionally, it would also notice that it seemed to suddenly have a kind of bloodthirsty and murderous thoughts. When it saw a weak animal or beast, it would want to tear it apart and drink its blood, but it had no interest in meat. Atsu did not like this idea, and it even felt a little disgusted. Fortunately, each time this feeling appeared, it was very short, and every time, Atsu would quickly wake up. It could not speak, and it could not express itself. It could not explain it clearly to Lu Chen, and it was not very willing to. Atsu felt that although Lu Chen used to look quite smart, it seemed to be smarter than him now. If he couldn't figure it out, Lu Chen wouldn't be able to do anything about it, so he had to think of another way. That was why Atsu had left Lu Chen behind for the past few days. Lu Chen's strength had probably increased by quite a bit in secret, so protecting himself wouldn't be a problem. Atsu, on the other hand, had more important things to do. It was not only for itself, but also for Lu Chen. That guy was so stupid, and with the black fire, he must have the same problem as itself. It had to find a solution and a way out for the two of them. Well, before going to Kunlun Mountain, Atsu actually couldn't come up with any good ideas after thinking for a long time. Until now, the oxen that had been hiding in the depths of Kunlun Mountain suddenly followed them to the Immortal City. This was the first time Lu Chen and the black dog saw oxen appear on Mount Celestial Dragon. They had never seen it before, so they naturally thought that this was the first time this extraordinary spirit beast had come to Mount Celestial Dragon. However, this was not the case. The truth was that oxen had come to Mount Celestial Dragon many years ago, even earlier than Supreme Lord Tian Lan. However, after that, oxen hated this place, and after leaving, it was never willing to return. Except this time. Supreme Lord Tian Lan was the only person in this world who knew the secret and those dusty stories, so it could be said that he was moved by oxen's visit this time, and he was even more grateful. Correspondingly, he quickly and decisively announced to the top of this mountain that he viewed this oxen in a different light. Both openly and secretly, he made his attitude known. You can mess with me, but if you dare to mess with this oxen, you're dead meat. Well, of course, to be honest, he was just saying it. Of course, oxen couldn't be messed with, and this seemingly polite divine transformation stage supreme definitely couldn't be messed with either. Whoever messed with him would have a short life. In short, overnight, oxen received the transcendent treatment that it used to receive on Mount Kunlun Mountain, even more so. Back on Mount Kunlun Mountain, most of the disciples of the Kunlun party knew that this bull was Supreme Lord Tian Lan's pet, and they loved it very much. However, when they met it, they would occasionally make fun of it, and those who were closer to it would go up and touch it, or say a few words to tease it. It was nothing. However, on the top of Mount Sky Dragon, the people of Zengxianmeng, including those of Fuyunji, all became respectful of this oxen after Supreme Lord Tianlan made his attitude clear, and then kept a respectful distance from it. Perhaps it was also because the atmosphere here was getting more and more tense secretly. Therefore, in this strange situation, Oxen suddenly found that apart from Supreme Lord Tianlan, the only one on the entire Mount Sky Dragon that dared to approach it was a dog. Well, actually, Oxen didn't care about this situation. There were so many people on the entire Mount Sky Dragon, and even though there were several divine transformation stage Supreme Lords, it really didn't care about anyone except Supreme Lord Tianlan. Well, maybe Lu Chen could barely be counted as an exception. Black dog, black dog. At least this dog named Atsu looked good. In terms of seniority, it was a good dog that had come to its side when it was on Mount Kunlun, and it was a good dog that had good eyesight and was eager to be its follower. As a result, Oxen's attitude toward Black Dog improved. Most of the time, it would stay in the Kunlun Palace and sleep. Atsu would also come to accompany it, but it didn't dare to enter the palace because it had been kicked out by Supreme Lord Tianlan before. Atsu was very smart. It knew who it should be afraid of, and who it shouldn't be afraid of. For example, it wasn't afraid of Lu Chen at all, because it knew that Lu Chen was good to it. Even if Lu Chen scolded it on a daily basis, he wouldn't harm it. However, that damn Baldy was different. If it angered him, he might really trample it to death. Oxen quickly sensed this, so it started to walk out of the palace. Then, it calmly brought Black Dog around Mount Tianlong. The people on Mount Zengxianmeng all retreated. Often, a cow and a dog could be seen walking on the main road, while a group of people hid by the roadside and looked at them curiously. Oxen turned a blind eye to this, and Atsu was very happy. It felt very cool. Then, Atsu didn't have enough composure, so it laughed and expressed it. Oxen was very disdainful of this, but it didn't care. Later, it started to walk down Mount Tianlong with Atsu and wander around Immortal City. Oxen and Black Dog's body shape was very eye-catching and prominent. At first glance, it was obvious that they weren't ordinary water buffaloes and native dogs. Their skin color, their body shape, and their spirit, it was obvious that they were either spirit beasts or rare spiritual creatures. If they were captured, they would be worth a lot of money. Therefore, it instantly attracted the attention of countless people, and many people made a move. A small half of these people were crushed and killed by Oxen and Atsu, while the other half were killed by the people of Zengxianmeng and Fuyunji, who were full of disdain and contempt. Most of the time, they would even curse, "Spirit beasts who dare to strut around on the streets of Immortal City like this, how dare you have the guts to have evil thoughts?" What he said made a lot of sense. Beasts were stronger than humans. This reality was quickly accepted and acknowledged by everyone. Then, when Oxen and Atsu walked on the streets, no one dared to stop them anymore. Instead, everyone hid far away. Until one day, when Oxen and Atsu walked on a long street, Atsu was chewing on a meat bone that it had picked up from God knows where, when it saw Oxen suddenly stop in its tracks. Atsu looked out in surprise, and saw a place in front of them that was surrounded by layers of cloth. Oxen looked at that place, and it was rare for him to be silent for a long time. Then, it suddenly took a step forward and walked behind the curtain. In a secluded corner of the street, a pair of bright and clear eyes looked at Oxen's back, and a trace of coldness flashed across its eyes. Chapter 567. Of course, there were guards around the curtain. Although this place was not conspicuous and the secret was well kept, not many outsiders knew about it. However, the thing below was too important, so many people were sent to watch over it. The guards stationed here were, of course, people from Zengxianmeng. Most of them were from Fuyunji, and a small number were from Starry Hall. The reason for this arrangement was, of course, that the leadership of the mysterious underground cave city had fallen into the hands of the two Zengxianmeng forces. As the most popular animals in Tianlong Mountain and Zhengxianmeng in recent days, oxen and black dog were already quite famous. The guards standing here also had to change shifts to go up the mountain. After a while, of course, they were very clear about the origin of this cow and dog. At this time, everyone was a little dumbfounded. Not to mention in the Immortal City, even on Tianlong Mountain where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located, these two spirit beasts almost strolled everywhere, and no one was nosy enough to stop them. Of course, unless it was some serious places, such as the cave residences of several deity transformation stage perfected cultivators, or the important places of several mountain halls, this kind of place was not allowed. However, it was hard to say for Atsu, but oxen seemed to be a giant beast that had become a spirit. It never went near places that were taboo and places that might have powerful figures such as deity transformation stage perfected cultivators. Because of this, they didn't go to important places, and people would certainly give face to perfected Lord Tianlan and Fuyunji, so they wouldn't stop them. But this time, it seemed to be a little different. Regardless of whether it was the guards of the Floating Clouds Division or the Starry Hall, as long as they were guarding this place, they had been warned sternly by their superiors before they came that the underground tunnel was an extremely important place, and they had to guard it with all their might. They could not be careless. And they had indeed achieved this. Although there were many problems in Zhengxianmeng today, such as overstaffing, extravagance and exaggeration, and evading responsibility, it was still a hegemon of a generation. It had a solid foundation, and it was still possible for its subordinates to take things seriously. However, the situation they were in right now was a little troublesome. Seeing that oxen and the black dog seemed to be very determined to walk into the curtain, the group of guards looked at each other. The people of Fuyunji looked at the guards of Starry Hall, and the people of Starry Hall looked at the experts of Fuyunji with hope. Then, everyone realized that there was nothing they could do. In the end, someone from the Starry Hall shouted, "Hey! Can you guys from Fuyunji block them?" There were many people on Fuyunji's side. Soon, someone replied, "Why? Why aren't you guys attacking?" The guard of the Starry Hall actually laughed. He seemed to be taking pleasure in their misfortune. He said, "These two bastards came from your Floating Clouds office, right?" The guards of Fuyunji were instantly speechless. Oxen was perfected Lord Tianlan's spiritual beast, and the black dog was the pet of perfected Lord Tianlan's only disciple, Lu Chen. Needless to say, the master and disciple's status was high, but they both liked to keep pets. This was something that could not be refuted. Helpless, when they saw the people from the Starry Hall retreating, the guards from the Floating Clouds Agency had no choice but to walk over. About 10 of them lined up in a row and formed a human wall, blocking the green bull and Atu's path. The green ox looked up and stopped in his tracks. Atu poked his head out from behind it to take a look, and was instantly a little angry. This fellow had recently been used to being arrogant with the green ox, and this was the first time he saw someone daring to block his way. He jumped out, bared his snow-white fangs, and roared at the person in front of him, baring his teeth in a fierce manner. Roar! His meaning could not be more obvious. "You blind people, get out of our way. Don't block our Lord Ox and Lord Dog from taking a stroll." The guards of the Floating Clouds Agency all had bitter expressions on their faces. One of them lowered his voice and whispered, "I say, this is Lord True Immortal's spiritual beast. Isn't it extremely powerful? If it gets angry, won't we be in trouble?" When the people next to them heard this, their expressions became even worse. This situation could be said to be the worst. It was even worse than when perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, Lu Chen, brought people over to stop them. Although Lu Chen's status was extremely high, he was still a human, and humans had to be reasonable, right? As long as they clearly explained the rules here, and everyone followed the rules, even Lu Chen could not do anything to them. But it was very annoying to deal with this ox and dog. If the spiritual beast in front of them got angry and rushed over to kill people, how would that end up? That was perfected Lord Tianlan's most beloved pet. Would anyone dare to reason with perfected Lord Tianlan? And even if perfected Lord Tianlan was reasonable, he would at most comfort them with kind words and give them some compensation. He would not really kill oxen to pay for it. If that happened, the dead would not be resurrected, and they would have died in vain. They were all people in Zhengxianmeng. Who didn't know this? Even small fries had their own intelligence and wit. Thus, no one dared to go up and criticize her sternly. This was a forbidden area, and she didn't allow them to wander around. However, it wasn't good for them to give way. Otherwise, if they were to be held accountable, Hall Master Shuang would definitely have to bear the consequences. After a while, Oxen became a little impatient. Black Dog saw that no one was paying attention to it, and immediately became angry. Did dogs not care about their reputation? Especially when there was an enigmatic boss, Oxen, behind it. Atsu bared its fangs and roared. It began to press forward with a very fierce momentum. It seemed like it was about to eat someone. The guards in Fuyunji were in an uproar. This black dog did not look like much on normal days, but when it suddenly became fierce, its momentum was very fierce and frightening. It was as if it was going to pounce on them and bite their throats in the next moment. There were a few sounds of pa 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 pa. 3 or 4 people pulled out their weapons at the same time. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Even the people from the Starry Hall who were watching from the sidelines stopped smiling and had solemn expressions on their faces. The guard duty here was very important. If something really happened, even if they were not the main responsibility, they would most likely be scolded or even punished. Atsu was not afraid of those weapons. It still slowly moved forward step by step. It was half testing and half pressuring. At the same time, a strange black flame flashed in the depths of its eyes. Just when the atmosphere suddenly became so tense that it made people hold their breath, they heard a low moo. Oxen appeared next to Atsu and blocked its way. Atsu glanced at Oxen and put away its fangs. The threatening momentum disappeared, and the guards in front of them immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Oxen raised its head and walked forward without saying a word. The guards only saw a blur in front of them, and the huge body of the bull was in front of them in an instant. The guards were shocked and were about to shout for it to stop when they suddenly saw the green ox shake its head. With a scream, the guard who was closest to the ox's head suddenly rose into the air, and then flew into the distance with a strange cry. With a bang, he smashed into a piece of cloth, and then tore off 3 or 4 pieces of cloth at the side. Immediately, the ground was a mess. Dang, dang. The group of guards suddenly stood up with a dignified look on their faces. They unsheathed their weapons and surrounded the cow and dog. Chapter 568. Everyone present was shocked. When the figure flew into the sky, everyone's gaze followed it, then turned their heads at the same time. They watched as the flying figure drew an arc in mid-air, then fell to the side of the curtain with a loud noise. A pile of things were torn off, revealing half of the tunnel entrance that was originally covered. Atsu poked its head out from behind Oxen's huge body and blinked its doggy eyes. It looked at this silent big guy with a look of admiration. It seemed like it really had a lot to learn. I seem to have heard Lu Qin say something like, "A dog that bites doesn't bark." However, Atu immediately felt that something wasn't quite right. Lu Chen's words seemed to be cursing someone. For a moment, the dog's mind wandered, and it began to recall the situation when Lu Chen said those words to it. Was it a sarcastic curse? After all, this person was too bad. He was full of bad ideas and would often be tricked. It was better to be careful. Not to mention the fact that Atsu actually dared to be distracted at this critical moment. The guards in front were in an uproar. They immediately pulled out their weapons and surrounded the 2 spirit beasts. However, they could only surround the 2 spiritual beasts. Although the weapons were extremely sharp and flashed with a cold light, none of the menacing guards dared to make a move against the 2 spiritual beasts. Beasts were stronger than humans. Was this the situation? Oxen seemed to turn a blind eye to the people in front of it. At this moment, its big bell-like eyes were looking at the secret underground entrance that was half exposed, and a strange light seemed to flash across its eyes. Then, without any hesitation, it lifted its foot and walked toward the entrance of the tunnel. Oxen's body was originally extremely huge. Although it had been silent, its aura was very intimidating. As it walked forward, the 5 or 6 human guards in front of it suddenly felt as if a small mountain was pressing down on them. Even their breathing became a little nervous. But at this critical moment, Oxen suddenly stopped and turned back to take a look. The pressure was instantly relieved, and the few of them let out a long sigh of relief. Just when they thought that the situation had taken a turn for the better, they noticed that Oxen had turned around to glare at the black dog, who was standing there in a daze for some reason. With a swing of its tail, it smacked the black dog's head. Atu was startled and woke up. He turned his head to look around and immediately felt a little embarrassed. He barked twice and trotted over. At the same time, he felt a little strange. In the past, he would never be in a daze at a time like this. What was going on today? Could it be that this oxen is too powerful, and I feel very safe, so I don't have any scruples? He had never felt this way before, even when he was with Lu Chen. Atsu glanced at Oxen and thought to himself, I'll have to hold on to this big bull leg in the future. Oxen woke up Atsu. Although it was a little dissatisfied, it didn't seem to be very angry. It turned back and walked forward again. The few guards' faces suddenly became bitter again. However, things had already come to this point, and they couldn't back down anymore. They looked at each other with a dignified expression, but each of them had already mobilized their spiritual power. Their weapons and magic weapons gradually lit up. This meant that they were going to fight to the death. Seeing these few Fuyunji people acting like this, the people next to them also suddenly became gloomy. No one shouted. All the Fuyunji people quickly moved, and a murderous aura rose around them. This time around, there was no longer any panic or apprehension. Instead, it was filled with a bloody aura. This was the characteristic of Fuyunji for many years, and it was cultivated from the sea of blood. In a place further away, the people from Starry Hall were originally gloating, but at this time, they suddenly felt this aura, and they instantly quieted down. One of the people in the lead hesitated for a moment, but he lowered his head and said something to the people next to him. Then, he turned around and rushed in the direction of Mount Tianlong in the distance. Oxen and the black dog were both spiritual beasts with keen senses, so of course, it was impossible for them not to feel this aura. Atsu was the first to stop. If dogs could frown, this black dog would be frowning right now. It was willing to wander around with Oxen, but after all, it had already gained spirituality and knew Lu Chen's position in Zhengxianmeng. To put it bluntly, these people were very likely to be Lu Chen's subordinates in the future. It didn't matter if they bullied them occasionally, but it was completely different to fight or even kill them. Atsu instantly wanted to retreat, and it barked at Oxen. However, Oxen, who was usually very lazy, was unusually persistent today for some reason. It seemed that it was determined to go to the secret passage. It turned a deaf ear to Atsu's barking. After pausing for a moment, it continued to move forward. Atsu was dumbfounded, but it couldn't just stand there, so it had to reluctantly follow. The people on the other side were waiting. As the two sides gradually approached each other, the street was silent. The situation was still tense, and a battle was about to break out. At this unusually tense moment, someone suddenly coughed behind the street, and then someone scolded, "Stupid dog, what are you doing over there? Hurry up and come over." Oxen stopped, and Atsu instantly turned around. Then, it saw Lu Chen and Old Ma walking over from the street. Their faces were very serious, and they seemed a little angry. Atsu let out a loud bark, and then it ran towards Lu Chen, wagging its tail vigorously along the way. No one knew why it was so happy. Lu Chen snorted, and then he patted the head of the dog that had rushed in front of him, and said in a low voice, "Stupid dog, you only know how to make trouble for me." Atsu seemed to not understand what he said, and it only grinned and wagged its tail. Lu Chen coughed, and then he walked towards Oxen. Oxen stared at him, and its eyes were deep, and it seemed to be a little gloomy. As for the surrounding guards who were nervously holding weapons in their hands, they still looked very stern, and none of them had any intention of putting down the magic weapons in their hands. Lu Chen walked to Oxen's side, and said in a low voice, "I say, the people here are all the damn Baldi's subordinates, don't do anything stupid." Oxen let out a low moo, but it didn't say anything. Lu Chen looked ahead again, and he frowned, and said, "You want to go down?" This time, Oxen nodded. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then he waved his hand to call the guard in front of him, and said with a serious expression, "Do I have the right to go down?" The guard nodded. Lu Chen was perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, and he was the one who discovered and destroyed the devil cult's lair, so he was definitely one of the few who had the right to go down. Lu Chen said, "Okay, then I'll go down now, and I'll bring these two to have a look." As he said that, he smiled, and said, "You don't think that they'll leak the secret, do you?" It was hard to say, since they were spirit beasts, but one of them was perfected Lord Tianlan, and the other was Lu Chen's, so the possibility of them leaking the secret was not high. Moreover, Lu Chen had said it himself, so it could be considered as giving everyone a way out. Therefore, everyone made way, and Lu Chen brought Oxen and the black dog down. Behind them, Old Ma also walked forward, but he was stopped by the guards, who said, "You can't go in." Old Ma was annoyed, and he pointed at the figures in front of him, and said angrily, "I'm not as good as those two beasts." The guard nodded. Yes. After saying that, he seemed to feel that his words were a little harsh, so he comforted Old Ma, "Don't be sad, we're the same." After that, everyone felt that it was a little strange, and everyone was a little embarrassed. However, in the midst of the chaos, a petite figure quietly followed behind Lu Chen and the others, and snuck into the secret passage. Chapter 569. It had been a while since Lu Chen last came to the underground city in the mysterious cave. When he walked through the passageway and saw the majestic underground city again, his heart was still the same as when he first saw this place. A feeling of admiration welled up in his heart along with a slightly strange feeling. The blood-red moon was still floating in the sky, emitting a seemingly endless blood-red light. It seemed that it would never stop, nor would it stop. It was like this blood-red moon had existed in this place ever since Pan Gu created the world, and had never changed. When the red light shone on him, Lu Chen's body and footsteps paused. At that moment, he felt an unpleasant aura that suppressed his spiritual power. However, he was not afraid of it, nor did he panic. Firstly, he could endure this feeling. Secondly, he had secretly proven that although the aura of this blood moon was strange, it only suppressed most ordinary cultivators. On the other hand, the mysterious black fire in his body was not affected by this place once it was activated. Back then, black fire had helped him a lot when he was able to break through the siege of the devil cult followers. Of course, with his many years of experience, black fire had already saved him many, many times. Thinking of this, Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He looked to his side and saw Oxen and Black Dog walking over. Among them, Atsu's body seemed to have paused for a moment, but soon returned to normal. On the contrary, Oxen, who had always been unfathomable, suddenly trembled and its movements became a little slower after being bathed in the light of the blood moon. At the next moment, Oxen seemed to have turned its huge horns with some difficulty and let out a low moo. Then, it suddenly staggered and almost fell to the ground. This time, both Lu Chen and Atsu were taken aback. No one expected that Oxen would have such a big reaction when they walked into this underground blood moon city. It was even a little scary. Lu Chen quickly turned around and supported Oxen's body. Atsu also rushed over in a hurry. It barked repeatedly and used its body to push against Oxen's stomach, trying to make it stand steadily. However, Oxen's body was a little too huge. Lu Chen and Atsu struggled to support it in a hurry. Fortunately, although Oxen still looked a little uncomfortable, it managed to stand firmly on its own after shaking for a while. Then, it slowly bent its legs and sat on the ground. Lu Chen was also stunned and puzzled. One must know that although the blood moon here had a strange power that could suppress many human cultivators, even if ordinary cultivators came in and felt uncomfortable, they wouldn't have such an obvious and serious reaction like oxen. Otherwise, they wouldn't have arranged for people from the Starry Hall to come here to do those secret things. The green ox knelt on the ground with its head drooped. After a while, it seemed to be in better spirits, but overall, it still gave off a rare feeling of illness. Lu Chen frowned and glanced at the blood moon in the sky. Then, he whispered to Oxen, "What's going on? If it really can't stand the blood moon, let's go out first." Oxen raised its pair of huge eyes and looked over Lu Chen's body at the houses below that were taller than ordinary human houses. It looked into the distance in silence. Its gaze swept across the street and finally fell on the center of the city, on the strange statue that connected the ground and the cave dome. "Moo!" Oxen called out in a low voice. Lu Chen followed its gaze and looked in that direction. Then, he hesitated for a moment and asked tentatively, "Do you want to go there?" Oxen nodded, but the black dog next to it seemed to be a little anxious and barked. Lu Chen was also a little worried. Looking at Oxen's dispirited appearance, he smiled bitterly and said, "There are two problems. First, you're too big and heavy. I can't move or push you. Second, we're only at the edge of the blood moon. Are you sure you won't die if we go further in?" Oxen hesitated for a moment, but it still looked at the statue in the distance with determination. Clearly, it still insisted on its idea. Atsu looked at it worriedly. However, Lu Chen wasn't Atsu, so he didn't have that kind of reverence for it. Therefore, Lu Chen quickly said without holding back, "Don't waste your time. I don't care if you want to die, but you're a treasure in the eyes of that damn Baldy. At the very least, I don't know what else he values more than you. If I really kill you here, that damn Baldy will fight me to the death." Oxen glared at Lu Chen with a hint of annoyance and anger in its eyes. Then, it put on a disdainful expression. "Tui!" Lu Chen slapped the top of the bull's head and scolded, "What are you pretending for? When I was still by that damn Baldy's side, you used that stupid look to trick me. Do you think I'll fall for it again?" A hint of helplessness appeared on Oxen's face as it fell silent. "Let's go." Lu Chen grabbed Oxen's head and pulled it back to where they came from. He said, "If you have the guts, you can ask that damn Baldy to send you down here himself. If anything happens to you, he'll be responsible for it. It has nothing to do with me. I don't care if you die or not." Atu was a little dumbfounded as he watched from the side. He did not expect Lu Chen to be so familiar with the green bull and treat it like an outsider. As for the green bull, it did not react much to Lu Chen's actions, perhaps because it was affected by the blood moon's brilliance or some other reason. Oxen even sighed softly. Yes, this cow sighed softly. There was a hint of helplessness in its voice, which was almost the same as a human's. Lu Chen didn't care about it as if he was already used to it. Behind them, Atsu was a little puzzled. At the other corner of the cave, behind a hidden rock, a petite figure slowly poked her head out. She revealed a pair of bright eyes as she watched the scene. There was a hint of astonishment in her eyes. In the end, Oxen didn't insist or struggle too much. It just left with Lu Chen even though it was unusually determined to come down to the underground city at the cost of fighting the guards. Therefore, it seemed that it had a strong start but a weak finish. However, from this, it could be seen that even though it was not as obvious as perfected Lord Tianlan's reaction, the green ox clearly viewed Lu Chen in a different light. Lu Chen brought the green bull and the black dog Atu down for a walk, then turned around and left without doing anything. It could be said that he was all bark and no bite. However, after they left, another figure suddenly walked out of the empty underground cave. It was an extremely beautiful young lady. It was White Lotus. Bai Lian first glanced at the passageway that they had come in from, and then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. She then looked at the blood moon in the sky, and after a while, she seemed to have made a decision. She strode forward and walked towards the strange statue in the center of the city, as if she wanted to investigate it herself. As she walked, her footsteps and movements seemed to be a little unnatural compared to usual. She should have been somewhat affected by the suppression of the blood moon, but it was still much better than the green ox. The suppression was not as great. As she stepped on the long street, a series of crisp footsteps echoed in the city. When the sound wave drifted, it spread to a deep dry well in a courtyard in a corner. A shadow in the darkness moved slightly. It raised its head and glanced at the world above. After a while, it seemed to move very slowly and then slowly stood up. Chapter 570. The huge underground cave was now silent. There were no signs of people or animals, including some common underground creatures such as bats and mice. White Lotus didn't see any of them. There was only the almost omnipresent blood-red light that shone down from the blood-red moon in the sky, filling every corner of this place. After White Lotus walked on the long street for a while, she couldn't help but look around. Those tall houses and pavilions were obviously not suitable for humans to live in. Although the old houses were there, the owners were gone. Those empty tall doors and big houses were stained with the color of blood, giving off a strange and eerie feeling, as if in the next moment, some kind of monster would rush out from some dark red corner and pounce on White Lotus. This feeling was very bad and frightening. White Lotus's delicate brows furrowed. She looked a little hesitant, as if she wanted to retreat and leave this place. However, her eyes then looked towards the depths of this underground city. After hesitating for a while, she finally continued to walk towards the tall but strange statue. Since she was already here, she had to take a clear look. This place was tightly guarded by the men of the Floating Clouds Agency and the Starry Hall. There had to be some kind of huge secret hidden underground. White Lotus walked step by step and approached the statue. Along the way, she walked very carefully. At the same time, she secretly felt strange. Logically speaking, the underground territory was so huge. With Zheng Xianmeng's strength and deep foundation in the immortal city for so many years, it was really impossible for him not to discover the strangeness of this underground. Then, why was this underground city only exposed recently? Could it be that it was really the ancestors of Zheng Xianmeng who sealed this place? Just when White Lotus was puzzled, when she walked past the door of a big house on the long street, she suddenly heard a sound. The sound was very soft and not very loud. However, because the surroundings were too quiet, it became especially clear and White Lotus heard it immediately. White Lotus immediately stopped in her tracks. Her expression changed slightly and she turned towards the house. The big house looked no different from the other houses that they had passed before. Looking from the door, it was also empty, and there was nothing suspicious about it. However, White Lotus didn't think that what she just heard was just an illusion. She heard it very clearly. She stood in the same place and stared at the depths of the house. For a moment, she was a little hesitant. Should she go in or leave this place? This underground city was so strange. Obviously, it was very likely that there was something strange and terrifying hidden here. However, White Lotus immediately remembered that Lu Chen had brought Oxen and Black Dog here. Judging from their actions and expressions, they didn't seem to feel any signs of danger here. Even if Lu Chen could act, Oxen and Black Dog definitely couldn't. White Lotus lifted her foot and wanted to walk towards the house, but she immediately put it down. After hesitating for a few times, she couldn't make a decision in the end. It could be said that her heart was in a dilemma. However, at this moment, White Lotus glanced at the ground in front of her and was suddenly shocked. At this moment, other than the red light shining on her body and drawing out a shadow on the ground, there was actually another shadow behind her. It was taller and longer than her, and just like that, it appeared behind her without a sound. White Lotus's body instantly turned as cold as water. She even held her breath. Lu Chen brought Oxen and Black Dog back to the surface. Seeing that they came out of the tunnel so quickly, the guards who were originally discussing among themselves were a little surprised. At the same time, many of them had a look of relief on their faces. In any case, in this short period of time, the most they could do was to go down and take a look at the scenery below. After that, they would have to hurry back. In such a short period of time, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything bad even if they wanted to. Everyone had a heavy responsibility on their shoulders, so it was better to avoid trouble. Immediately, someone came over to greet Lu Chen politely. Lu Chen responded with a few perfunctory words and then turned to look at Oxen. After leaving the light of the blood moon underground, Oxen's mental state was obviously a lot better. However, its head was still drooping, and it seemed to be a little dispirited. Lu Chen thought for a while, then left the tunnel entrance with Oxen and Atsu. On the way, he greeted Old Ma who was standing on the side. Old Ma rushed over and said with a surprised expression, "What happened? You came out so quickly." "I'll tell you in detail later." Lu Chen also said perfunctory words to Old Ma. Then, he gestured to Old Ma to help him. Together, they supported the sickly oxen and walked toward Mount Tianlong. As for the direction, it was naturally the Kunlun Palace of Supreme Lord Tianlong. Therefore, about an hour later, although his spirit had recovered slightly, the Green Bull, who had spent a lot of time on the way, finally returned to the Kunlun Hall under Lu Chen's strong request. Fortunately, Supreme Lord Tianlong didn't go out today. He stayed in the palace. When the footsteps of Lu Chen and Old Ma came from the gate, as well as the slightly messy steps of the two spirit beasts, Supreme Lord Tianlong, who was sitting on the lotus throne, glanced at the gate. After a while, his attention seemed to be completely focused on Oxen. Old Ma, who was following Lu Chen, was about to bow to Supreme Lord Tianlong who was sitting on the lotus throne in the distance. However, at that moment, he felt dizzy, and then a tall and sturdy figure suddenly appeared in front of him. In that short moment, Supreme Lord Tianlong had passed through the long palace and directly came to the side of Oxen. Oxen raised its head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlong, and called out in a low voice. Supreme Lord Tianlong's expression changed slightly. It seemed that his expression was a little ugly. He walked forward with a sullen face. He first looked at Oxen's complexion. Then, he suddenly put his hand on Oxen's head, touched its ears, and opened its eyelids to have a look. Then, he put his hand on the side of Oxen's chest and carefully felt it. His expression became even more ugly. Where did it go? Supreme Lord Tianlong turned to Lu Chen and asked. Oxen took a look at Lu Chen, and there seemed to be some hidden meaning in its eyes. However, Lu Chen did not keep it a secret at all. In the blink of an eye, he told everything clearly from the beginning to the end, including the matter of Oxen and Atsu strolling on the street at the beginning. After hearing that Oxen actually ran to the underground city, Supreme Lord Tianlong first snorted. Then, when he heard Lu Chen say that it immediately collapsed after entering the underground city, he couldn't help but shake his head. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Then, he waved to the side and said, Old Ma, you can leave now. Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but he still obeyed and left the hall. The moment he stepped out of the door, he vaguely heard Supreme Lord Tianlong instructing Lu Chen, you also go down. Do you feel uncomfortable? Lu Chen slightly lowered his eyes and said, well, I feel that after staying there for a long time, my whole body has begun to feel strange. I can't use my strength, and even the circulation of spiritual qi has slowed down. If I really have to fight fiercely in the underground city, I think I can only use 4 or 5 of my full strength at most. Supreme Lord Tianlong smiled and looked at Lu Chen for a moment. Then, he sat beside Oxen, pressed its head with one hand, and pressed its chest with the other. After a while, a warm breath of pure yang was slowly emitted from his body. With the appearance of this yang qi, Oxen's face was obviously much better. Lu Chen, on the other hand, stood aside and looked at perfected Lord Tianlong's broad and strong back from the side. Suddenly, a daring idea occurred to him. They are all divine transformation realm perfected cultivators, and they are so powerful that they can shake the world. But will they also be like Elder Yun Shouyang of the devil cult, who had his heart meridian cut off and could no longer fight back? What was the name of that mysterious magic incantation formation? Well, by the way, it seemed to be called, God Subduing Spell. Chapter 571. At that moment, Lu Chen was a little absent-minded. Just now, he suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he recalled what happened in the barren valley. Once upon a time, he always felt that that memory was accompanied by unforgettable pain, which was deeply buried in his heart and would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would never be able to find peace and forget it. After all, every time he suffered the pain of being burned by the black flames, he would recall the people and events of the past, as well as the blood on his hands, as well as the things he had seen in those dark times that he did not want to recall. However, now that it had come to this, he realized to his shock that he had underestimated time in the end. No matter how deep the pain was, it would be relieved with the passage of time. If people were not repeatedly reminded of it, perhaps those memories would be quietly erased from the depths of their consciousness. Who would deliberately recall those painful memories, unless it was the kind of unforgettable hatred that had been engraved in their hearts? Young children used to naively think that they would remember every beautiful moment and tell themselves that this moment was so important that they would never forget it. Then, when they grew up and looked back on the past, they found that everything had been covered by the dust of the past, and they could no longer recall the memories of those years. However, they still remembered the solemn and beautiful feelings of the children. "What's wrong with you?" Suddenly, the voice of Supreme Lord Tianlan came from the front, awakening Lu Chen from that somewhat bewildered state. He turned around and saw that Oxen, who had been lying on the ground sickly, had now stood up and seemed to be in much better spirits. He didn't know what method Supreme Lord Tianlan had used just now, but it was like a miraculous cure that had instantly freed Oxen from the state of being suppressed by the aura of the blood moon. After looking around, Oxen walked to its favorite seat at the side of the hall and lay down. Atsu followed it and wagged its tail gently, looking up and down curiously at Oxen's body, as if it was very surprised by this magical change. "I'm fine." Lu Chen naturally changed the topic. Looking at Oxen, he asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, "What's wrong with this bull?" Although the underground blood moon was strange, it shouldn't be to this extent. These days, quite a number of human cultivators from Fuyunji and Starry Hall have gone down there. Some of them have high attainments, but I have never heard of anyone having such a big reaction like this one. Perfected Lord Tianlan took another look at him and said indifferently, "I'm not sure either. Perhaps the blood moon's suppression on Oxen is particularly strong." Lu Chen mumbled, "It's strange this time as well. I remember that whenever this cow was in danger, it would always sense it beforehand and avoid it. It's never been in such a sorry state like this." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and hesitated. When Lu Chen saw his indifferent expression, he bid farewell and walked out. Watching his disciple leave, Perfected Lord Tianlan's expressionless face gradually changed. He turned to look at Oxen, who was lying on the other side of the hall. He then slowly walked over and sat down beside Oxen. His expression gradually became a little strange, abnormally complicated, and mixed with some inexplicable emotions. In the quiet hall, after a long time, there seemed to be a sigh. Then, someone said faintly, "Are you already old?" In the mysterious underground city shrouded by the light of the blood moon, White Lotus felt cold all over, as if she had fallen into an ice cellar. She stared at the shadow reflected on the ground in front of her. Other than her own shadow, there was another shadow that was even bigger. This was an underground world that was so quiet that it could even be said to be dead. Under the blood-red light, there seemed to be no living creatures here. As long as the human cultivators in Zhengxianmeng did not come here, there would be no human figures, no animals, and not even a common plant. Under the blood-red light, even the omnipresent sounds of insects could not be found. Therefore, it was hard not to associate the figure that suddenly appeared in this place with something like a demon or a ghost. For White Lotus, that short moment felt like a particularly long and torturous time. Her hands seemed to stretch forward in a panic, but she did not look back. Suddenly, she let out a low shout, and her petite body suddenly flew forward. At the same time, she waved her hands backward with force. Then, the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped, and 2 icy snowstorms swept over and hit her back. "Huh?" The mysterious figure seemed to be surprised. Snow Wind Scripture. The Snow Wind Scripture was actually not very famous. In the world of cultivation, more than half of the people had never heard of this thing. However, in the hearts of those who knew about this thing, this snow-wind scripture was undoubtedly the most powerful thing in the world. The snow-wind scripture was undoubtedly related to Hakushin Jinkuin of the Kunlun party. In fact, before Hakushin Jinkuin, this snow-wind scripture had never appeared, so some people thought that perhaps Hakushin Jinkuin had created this snow-wind scripture. However, there were also people who privately thought that although Hakushin Jinkuin was very powerful, his and Lord Tianlan's master, Master Tian Hong, was the truly amazing heaven's favored one, and most likely inherited it from their master. However, this mysterious and unfathomable Tao, art, and divine power seemed to have always had a bumpy fate. When perfected Lord Bai Chen was still alive, he did not teach his two eldest disciples, who had such great aptitudes. In the end, he only taught it to his last disciple, the young girl White Lotus, who was only about 10 years old. Now that he had passed away, White Lotus might be the last person in the world who knew such a powerful and strange snow-wind scripture. However, even though the snow-wind scripture was powerful, if one's cultivation was not enough, it would still be a tree without roots, a duckweed without roots. After the initial shock, the black figure swayed a few times. Although it seemed slow, it was actually very fast. In an instant, it flashed past the two snowstorms that looked like they could freeze a person's flesh and blood, and caught up with White Lotus. White Lotus felt a sharp aura locked onto her back like a blade. That feeling of uneasiness and danger grew stronger. In a moment of desperation, she was about to make another killing move when suddenly her vision blurred. That black figure appeared in front of her like a ghost. White Lotus was shocked, her body could not stop and crashed forward. But at this moment, her eyes suddenly flashed past a ferocious mask with a green face and long fangs. The person who appeared in front of her was wearing this mask. White Lotus's heart suddenly tightened. At that moment, she suddenly thought of a person, that person, although she had never seen him but she had heard of him countless times in Zhengxianmeng. Elder Ghost of the Evil Faction. Chapter 572. Lu Chen left the Kunlun Hall with Atsu. When he came out, he saw Old Ma standing alone outside the door. He walked over to Old Ma and greeted him from afar. Old Ma smiled and nodded as he walked over. "I thought you went back first," Lu Chen said to Old Ma with a smile. Old Ma smiled and shook his head. He glanced in the direction of the Kunlun Hall and then looked at Lu Chen with a questioning look. Lu Chen shook his head, indicating that there was nothing inside. Old Ma grunted in acknowledgement. Then, he said to Lu Chen, "Oh, by the way, Hall Master Shui from the Floating Clouds Division sent someone to look for you. He wants to invite you over to discuss something." Lu Chen was startled and said, "What did they say?" Old Ma said, "That's nothing, but I saw that the messenger who came just now looked normal. He didn't look anxious or anxious. I don't think it's anything urgent." Lu Chen nodded. Thinking that there was nothing urgent at the moment, he walked towards the Fuyunji Hall. Not long after, they arrived outside the Fuyunji Hall. After all, this place was not too far from the Kunlun Hall. Someone had already announced their arrival. Not long after, they politely invited Lu Chen and Old Ma in with Shui Ying's orders. As for the black dog, it didn't follow them in. Recently, the dog didn't seem to like this kind of grand and spacious hall very much. It didn't want to go in easily, so it ran away on its own. Lu Chen and Old Ma didn't care about this. The black dog was getting smarter and had a backer. No one on Mount Celestial Dragon would deliberately make things difficult for it, so it ran around freely. After a while, the two of them were brought to the living room of the Fuyunji Hall. Shuang sat there and waited. But what surprised Lu Chen and Old Ma was that there was another person in the room. It was Chen He, who had been betrayed by Lu Chen from the devil cult. Logically speaking, there were many reasons why Chen He would betray the evil sect and attack his old master, but Lu Chen's role was undoubtedly at the top of the list. Without Lu Chen, Chen He might have died in Fuyunji's prison, and not become an honored guest of Fuyunji after betraying the devil cult. It was precisely because of this that Chen He spent most of his time by Lu Chen's side when he first defected, showing his loyalty to Lu Chen. In the eyes of outsiders, he was the new generation of Lu Chen's henchmen. However, for some unknown reason, after the Fuyun Company had schemed for a long time and finally dealt a heavy blow to the evil cult, almost completely uprooting this malignant tumor from the huge immortal city, Lu Chen, intentionally or unintentionally, began to distance himself from Chen He. Usually, they were just acquaintances who nodded at each other and did not really have the intention to accept him as a confidant. This was out of many people's expectations, including the leader of Fuyunji, Shuaing, and Chen He himself. They all thought that Lu Chen would naturally expand his power. Shuaing was very vigilant about this, and Chen He was very excited. He couldn't wait to become Lu Chen's core team. When Lu Chen truly inherited the foundation of Lord Tianlan, he would be able to soar to the sky. So, during that period of time, Chen He did everything possible to express goodwill to Lu Chen, and worked hard to leave a good impression on his future boss. Of course, the final result was not bad, but he did not catch Elder Ghost, so it was not perfect. Maybe it was because of this that Lu Chen hated him. Chen He could not help but think so. He was a defector, and in terms of experience and strength, he could not compare to the people on Fuyunji's side. In order to survive, there were almost no surprises in the choice he had to make next. He quickly approached Shuaing, and after Shuaing slightly relented and showed some intentions, he officially defected to her side. Seeing Lu Chen and old Ma walk in, Shuaing and Chen He also stood up, a smile on their faces. Shuaiying's smile was calm and light, elegant and polite, while Chen He's smile was a little more enthusiastic, and he even took the initiative to greet Lu Chen and old Ma. Lu Chen also smiled, seemingly not minding Chen He's action of approaching Shuaing. After exchanging a few words of modesty with him, Lu Chen smiled and sat down on his seat. He then smiled at Shuaing and said, "Hall Master Shue, why have you called me here today?" Shuaing nodded, not intending to beat around the bush, and said, "I heard that you plan to tell the true Lord that there is a lack of manpower in the Western continent to hunt down the remnants of the devil cult, so you want to send old Ma there?" Lu Chen's eyes flashed, but his expression did not change. Instead, it was old Ma who was sitting beside him who was faintly surprised, not quite understanding why Shuaing suddenly brought this up. At this moment, Lu Chen said, "Yes, I have already mentioned this to Master, and wanted to send old Ma over. But Master said that the immortal city also needs a lot of manpower, and it is not appropriate to send too many people out, so he declined." Shuaing nodded, looked at Lu Chen, and said with a smile, "It's like this, I invited junior brother Lu here today because there is something I want to tell you. The matter of hunting down the evildoers of the devil cult in the Western continent is indeed very important, and it is true that there is a lack of manpower there. So after thinking about it, I have decided to send Chen He over. He has been to the Western continent before, and has had a lot of contact with the local devil cult demons, so he is the best candidate for this task." Lu Chen and old Ma's expressions changed slightly, and then they looked at Chen He together. They saw Chen He smiling, as if nothing had happened. Lu Chen frowned, and he pondered deeply for a moment before he said, "You have to personally tell Master about this matter." I have already reported it to Lord True Lord." Shuaing smiled and used a gentle voice to interrupt Lu Chen's words, and said, "He has approved." Lord True Lord Tianlan had approved Shuaiying's request. Lu Chen's expression changed again, and he could not help but look up at Shuaiying's smiling face. After a while, he said, "That is good." Then he turned to look at Chen He, and this time his face was full of smiles, and said, "There are a lot of evildoers in the Western continent, Brother Chen will have to work hard in the future." Chen He shook his head, and said with a smile, No, we are all working for Lord True Lord. For the sake of his grand plans, it is only our duty." Lu Chen and old Ma looked at each other, and then looked away. The two sides chatted happily for a while, and then Lu Chen and old Ma said goodbye, but they were very quiet on the road. After walking for a while, old Ma lowered his voice, and asked, "Lord True Lord did not tell you about these things?" Lu Chen shook his head, and just as he was about to speak, he found that he and old Ma had walked to the row of houses where the elite disciples of the Kunlun party were. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and looked at the familiar house, and suddenly asked, White Lotus is still living in Su Qingjuan's house, right? Old Ma grunted, and was about to say something, when he suddenly saw someone coming from the road in front of them, and turned into the row of houses about 100 feet away from them. From afar, it was He, who they had not seen for a while. Old Ma frowned, and muttered, that person's cultivation is not bad, he seems to have a fierce murderous aura. Chapter 573. He didn't seem to notice Lu Chen and Old Ma coming from afar. He turned into the back of the row of houses expressionlessly and soon disappeared. Lu Chen glanced at Old Ma. Old Ma thought for a moment and said, he should also be living here. Among the group of people that the Kunlun party transferred here last time, Fuyunji has basically gathered and settled down. But I can't remember which room he lives in exactly now. Lu Chen nodded slightly and didn't say anything. In Kunlun sect, He was a proud son of heaven with boundless glory, an outstanding talent among the young generation of disciples, but after coming to the Immortal City, because the true Immortal Alliance had gathered the most outstanding talents in the world, not to mention others, there were 5 to 6 deity transformation stage perfected cultivators who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, and there were even more nascent soul stage perfected cultivators. Who would pay special attention to one of the countless Jindan stage cultivators? In a place like the Immortal City where all the power and precious resources in the world were gathered, to a certain extent, the importance of the cultivation of an ordinary cultivator was much less than in other places. The people here were more used to looking at a person's background and identity to judge his strength. This was a kind of alienation, but also a kind of reality. For example, Lu Chen's cultivation and realm were obscure and hard to understand. On the surface, he might not be stronger than He, but in the Immortal City, his reputation was undoubtedly 100 times better than He's. Whether it was Lu Chen or Old Ma, they both had a lot of troubles at the moment, and He had never done anything out of line or eye-catching since he came to the Immortal City, so they didn't care about him. Because of the incident with He Gang, Lu Chen naturally had a kind of vigilance and alienation towards He, but now he didn't have any thoughts of targeting this person. The past was over, and the secrets were covered in dust. No one would ever mention the past again. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, tossing those memories aside. He then said to Old Ma in a low voice, just now in Fuyunji, you didn't show any dissatisfaction in front of Blood Warbler, did you? Old Ma was startled. His expression turned solemn, and he recalled for a while with some seriousness. Then, he shook his head and said, no, from the beginning to the end, I had a smile on my face. There was absolutely no anger or annoyance on my face. Lu Chen glanced at him, snorted coldly, and said, so you are unhappy in your heart? Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, if it were you, would you still be happy? Of course not. Lu Chen admitted to this point very straightforwardly. Then, his expression darkened slightly as he said, Blood Warbler called Chen He over in front of us and purposely brought up this matter. Could it be that she's trying to show off to us? Recently, she has been getting more and more out of hand. Old Ma frowned. His first reaction was not to reply, but to look around first. Seeing that there was no one around them, only the two of them, he let out a sigh of relief. Then, he said in a low voice, even if you want to complain, let's find a safe place with no one to curse, okay? There is no one around here, Lu Chen said calmly. Otherwise, Atsu will find out. Atsu? Old Ma was shocked, and said, didn't it just run to? Before he finished speaking, Old Ma saw a dog's head poking out from the corner of a house in front of them. It glanced at them, and then yawned lazily. It was Atsu. Old Ma swallowed the words that he didn't want to say. He looked at Atsu and clicked his tongue. I've watched this dog grow up. He has changed so much. I don't know what he ate, but he seems to have become a demon. Old Ma was speechless. Lu Chen ignored Old Ma's praise for Atsu and just waved at Atsu. Old Ma saw this from the side, and subconsciously thought that Atsu would probably be like those legendary assassins who appeared and disappeared without a trace with a whoosh, and then suddenly jump out at a critical moment to deal a fatal blow. In the end, the black dog lay on the ground and buried its head between its two front paws. It looked like it was sunbathing and getting ready to sleep. Lu Chen's movement froze, and he cursed. It sounded like he was exasperated at old Ma's failure to meet his expectations, but other than that, he did not express anything else. He pulled old Ma and continued to walk forward, but he still lowered his voice. "What are you thinking about?" Old Ma was quite straightforward and said, "Right now, the entire Floating Clouds agency knows that I'm one of your people. However, True Monarch has prevented me from leaving, yet you've agreed to Blood Warbler's request. Isn't this somewhat inappropriate?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and said, "The damn Baldy has always been strange, and his actions are always unexpected. It is hard to say." After a pause, Lu Chen said, "However, I have been in the limelight recently, and Shuang has been in charge of Fuyunji for many years. She has always been known as the #1 person under Tianlan. The damn Baldy probably did this because he weighed the pros and cons." Old Ma sighed and said, "Is he sacrificing a small fry like me to comfort the other side?" Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "Don't talk nonsense about sacrifice. I didn't ask you to die." Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately, those big shots outside don't know about our little business. Otherwise, if they send someone to kill him, how are you going to defend yourself in front of perfected immortal?" Lu Chen also laughed and said, "What's the big deal? I will just say that you did it." He patted old Ma's shoulder and said with a smile, "Anyway, you are already dissatisfied. You have the motive, and we don't want to talk about the means. The murderer is you." "Bah!" Old Ma spat angrily, "You are the most useless boss I have ever worked for." Lu Chen laughed. He sat in his room. The door was closed, the window was closed, and even the curtains were drawn, so the room was very dark and quiet. It was probably because of this that the hearty laughter from outside could be heard from afar, causing him to raise his head and look in the direction of the door. His face was still young and handsome. He was still high-spirited and had achievements that many people envied and yearned for. He dreamed that one day he could become the second Lu Chen, and then he would have no regrets in his life. But in He Yi's heart, there was a lot of regret and hatred. In fact, sometimes he also had some doubts. His achievements were obviously good enough, but he was always not satisfied. He lowered his head. The dim light fell on his face, only illuminating half of his cheeks. He seemed to be sitting in the boundary between light and darkness. He seemed to be thinking, but also seemed to be hesitating. He was like a child standing on the edge of a cliff. In front of him was the most beautiful flower in the world, but below his feet was a bottomless abyss. Should he take this step? He slowly pulled out his long sword. The sword light reflected in his eyes, like a ghost in the dark. He didn't know how long he sat like this. It was quiet around him until the sky outside the room darkened and his room was completely plunged into darkness. Late at night. He slowly raised his head, stood up with his sword, and then opened the door and walked out. Chapter 574. In the dead of night, the wind blew from the northwest, bringing with it a bit of coldness. It circled above Mount Tianlong, letting out a mournful whine as it whizzed past. The night was dark and somber. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the usual moon and stars could not be seen. The trees on the mountain also seemed to be shivering in the wind. It was a dark and windy night. He walked silently in the shadows. His weapon had already been sheathed, and he was also dressed in a dark robe. He seemed to have blended in with the darkness, and it was almost impossible to notice that there was a figure quietly moving forward at the edge of the darkness. There was no trace of anyone around, but there were many buildings and pavilions in the distance. Those were the halls of Zhengxianmeng. Many of them were built tall and magnificent, and even in the dark night, they looked extraordinary. Like a giant in the day, like a giant beast in the night. However, in the dead of night, most of these places were dark and quiet. Even if one or two lights were lit occasionally, it was like the light of a firefly, shining faintly in the dark night, but not far away. He walked forward quietly. His face was expressionless. Although he looked young, he seemed to be faintly tired. However, his eyes were still as bright as ever, as if to prove that he had not given up on his first dream, and that he still had enthusiasm and yearning for the future. Although the road under his feet was longer than he had thought, he still had to walk until the final peak. Sometimes he would think that he would probably be able to breathe a sigh of relief on that day. His younger brother had died so early and so miserably. Now, he was the only one who could fulfill the wishes of the two brothers when they first climbed up Mount Kunlun. Even his younger brother's share had been completed together. The night wind was really a bit cold. Although he had already cultivated and was not afraid of this mere chill, he still seemed to pull at his clothes subconsciously. The surrounding night was like a wide layer of black gauze, protecting his whereabouts. His eyes were searching in the night, quietly moving towards a predetermined direction. That place should not be too far away, and he was almost there. For some reason, he suddenly became a little distracted. At that moment, he suddenly felt that he seemed to be like a mysterious figure in the past, a shadow. Those mysterious shadows that belonged to Fuyunji. Fuyunji was the most powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, and those mysterious and strange shadows hidden in the dark were its most terrifying power. There were many kinds of shadows, but in the eyes of outsiders, there were two kinds that were the most terrifying. One was the killer, and the other was the spy. An assassin in the darkness could kill anyone, but an insider would destroy everything that was originally as firm as a rock. What's more, in the legends, the things hidden in the depths of the floating clouds agency, the most terrifying shadows, had already combined these two identities into one. It was said that the once prosperous devil cult, the powerful devil cult that once fought against the orthodox cultivation world, was destroyed by such a shadow. He felt the chill on his body getting heavier. All the shadows in Fuyunji belonged to the high and mighty Lord Tianlan. It was precisely because of such terrifying power and his unfathomable strength that Lord Tianlan could become the world's most powerful person today. He suddenly thought of Lu Chen. Of course, he was not unfamiliar with that person. In the past, he had several disputes with this person, and even in the depths of the southern land of chaos, he once killed this person and knocked him out of Longchuan. Of course, he thought that this person was already dead, and he was very proud to repay Lord Tianlan, looking forward to using this merit to move the Divine Transformation Lord's heart, so that he would accept him as a disciple. In the end, none of this happened. He used to be very confused, but a few years later, on Mount Celestial Dragon, he saw with his own eyes the scene of Lord Tianlan accepting Lu Chen as a disciple. His face was calm, but at that moment, his heart was completely filled with despair. After all, the world was full of malice towards people like him who struggled to become immortal. In order to please Lord Tianlan, after a painful struggle, he did not hesitate to kill his master and Dukanjinren, who had raised him into a talent. Until today, he often saw the look his master gave him before he died, and then woke up with a cold sweat all over his body. In the same way, in order to please the bald lord, he spared no effort to hunt him down for thousands of miles, but in the end, not only did he end up in vain, but Tianlan actually accepted Lu Chen as a disciple. What did this mean? It was clear that there was some kind of secret relationship between them a long time ago, but he had been hiding it from him. At the moment when he saw the apprenticeship ceremony, he had never felt the pain of being fooled and humiliated like this. He felt that every smile of the master and disciple was aimed at him, with coldness and ridicule that went deep into his bones. His loyalty to Tianlan and his attachment to Kunlun were silently shattered at that moment. He knew that he had no future in the power of Lord Tianlan, and sooner or later, there would only be an unexpected disaster and an accidental death waiting for him. Even until now, neither Tianlan nor Lu Chen took any action against him. Because he asked himself honestly, if he were in Tianlan's position, he would definitely not let go of an enemy who tried to kill him. He had no way to go, and there was no place for him to retreat. He had to fight to the death. He looked up and saw the house. He came here, to the last destination of the night. In the silent night, the night that enveloped Sky Dragon Mountain was the same as usual. At the beginning, there was no difference, until suddenly, in a hall in the night, a shrill scream rang out. That scream was sharp and resounding, and seemed to carry some anger and doubt. But then, another angry and crisp voice rang out, resounding through the nearby mountains. In the dark night, in a moment, many lights were lit up. In some places that reacted quickly, there were already people holding torches and rushing out, approaching the place where the scream came from. However, before the crowd could get close, there was a sudden change in the dark night. A bright and dazzling firework suddenly shot up into the sky with a shrill scream, shooting straight into the vault of heaven, blossoming with unparalleled dazzling light, and then exploded with a loud bang in the sky. Like a sudden clap of thunder, it caused the mountains to shake, and immediately startled the entire Sky Dragon Mountain. For a moment, in the near and far, countless lights were lit up. It was unknown how many people were awakened from their dreams, and then raised their eyes to look at the sky. When they saw the firework that turned into a brilliant rain of flowers slowly falling from the sky, some were stunned, some were doubtful, and some suddenly changed their expressions. After a moment, suddenly, a low, old voice that seemed to contain infinite power suddenly rang out in the night sky, as if a god had descended, causing the wind and clouds to roll. "How dare you? Who dares to bully my, Taihu's daughter?" The mountains shook, and the heavens and the earth were shocked. Chapter 575. Mount Tianlong was the location of the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng. As the #1 rich and powerful organization in the world and the leader of the righteous path, this place had become the center of the world of cultivation, like the capital of a dynasty. Many cultivators, including the immortal city at the foot of the mountain, yearned for this place, flocked from all directions and gathered here. There were 6 deity stage cultivators in this huge mountain range, and the rest of the Yuanying, Jin Dan, and Foundation establishment cultivators were innumerable. Therefore, when the thunderous roar suddenly resounded in the sky, the entire celestial dragon mountain seemed to have been jolted awake from a dream of the dark night and woke up in an instant. Looking from a distance, one could clearly see many light spots swaying between the mountain peaks, and it was obvious that they were moving and gathering in the direction of the accident. Further away, one could vaguely see the residences of several other big shots. There didn't seem to be much movement, but the lights were also lit up, as if they were watching the situation from afar. Under the sky, in the boundless night, an indescribably powerful force fell from the sky, landing on the top of the pavilion that did not look particularly majestic. At this time, many people had quickly gathered in the nearby mountains, most of them were awakened and came to watch the show, or some had some other thoughts. In addition, there was a group of people dressed neatly and in the same style. They were the people of Tianlai Hall. Compared to the other unorganized and somewhat disorderly idlers, the actions of the Heavenly Law Hall's side were obviously much more decisive. After all, the one who had bellowed earlier was the boss of the Heavenly Law Hall, true monarch Tiehu. Therefore, it did not take long before the elite troops of the Heavenly Law Hall, which seemed to have at least 100 people, had already passed through the crowd and tightly surrounded the small building that had a signboard with the words Tingyu Building written on it. At the same time, on the top of this small building, a person was floating in the void, with a powerful momentum, an angry face, and a slightly low cultivation that made people dare not look directly at him. It was the leader of Tianlai Hall, Immortal Tiehu. In the distance, there were more people rushing over in the night. It was not that these people were fools who did not know that mortals would avoid a fight between immortals, but this was where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located. How could there be a powerful enemy who dared to come here? Seriously, in such a place, deity stage Immortal Tiehu had some scruples, and the incident happened suddenly. Everyone had to take a few more glances and gather more information, which was beneficial without harm. Maybe in the future, when the big shots in their own mountains asked, they would have something to say. Well, the above were all superficial words. Nowadays, the devil cult had been suppressed, and the true immortal alliance had unified the world. Who would dare to provoke them? Everyone had nothing to do anyway, so they all came over to watch a good show. Furthermore, the deity transformation stage perfected cultivator's words seemed to imply that the beautiful Song Wenji seemed to have been bullied. There was no lack of smart people in this world. There was no such thing as an impenetrable wall in this world. Rumors, gossip, and the like never stopped on this celestial dragon mountain. It was just that because of various reasons, it could not be put out in the open. But how could some shady matters in private be completely hidden from people? Therefore, more and more people were curious, excited, and ran over. And those with deep minds had already taken this opportunity to secretly think if there were any opportunities that could be used. Father, the Tingyu building, which was tightly surrounded by the crowd, suddenly came a cry from the inside of the building, which seemed to be tight on the inside but loose on the outside. A moment later, a female figure opened the door of the building and staggered out. The flashing light shone on the woman, and there was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Many people even cried out involuntarily. The person who ran out was Song Wenji. However, her current appearance was a little embarrassing. Her originally charming face had lost all color, and her clothes were in a mess. There were a few places where her clothes were torn, revealing her snow-white shoulders and some skin on her chest. Under the light of the fire, she looked haggard and heart-wrenching, but faintly, she had a different kind of charm and beauty. After the hubbub, the crowd soon quieted down again. Some quick-witted people had already gasped and subconsciously looked up at the night sky. Sure enough, Immortal Tiehu, who saw this scene in mid-air, was so angry that his whole body trembled. His voice was like thunder as he shouted, "Shameless scum, so bold for lust. Quickly come out and accept your death." At that moment, many people looked at the Tingyu building, only to see that there was no candlelight inside. It was pitch black, and they could not see clearly who was inside. However, everyone's eyes were filled with surprise and curiosity. They thought to themselves, how could there be such an ignorant person on Mount Tianlong who doesn't know what's good for him? How dare he touch the exclusive property of a deity transformation stage immortal? Seeing Immortal Tiehu stamping with rage in mid-air, in such a situation, unless the other 5 deity transformation stage immortals came out, there should be no one who could protect the life of the extremely bold perverted thief in the building. As for whether the other 5 deity transformation stage immortals would come out or not, there was no need to think about it. Definitely not. For such a thing to come out, how could a true immortal keep his face? Song Wenji cried bitterly at Immortal Tiehu in mid-air, kneeling on the ground and shaking her shoulders, looking very painful and sad. However, at some point in time, her eyes still swept across the crowd in the distance from the corner of her eyes. Then, she quickly saw a certain person in the crowd, as well as the few expert guards who quietly followed behind that person to protect him. She withdrew her gaze and continued to cry, as if she was really very sad. He looked at the road under his feet. The darkness of the night covered everything, making the road in front of him look very blurry. Just a little bit further and it completely blended into the darkness, as if there was no way to go, but also as if there were countless possibilities, luring him to take that step. The sound of hurried footsteps had already gone far away, and the guards who were set up to protect that person naturally followed. The person who was quietly squatting in the shadows outside the house slowly stood up, like an evil ghost quietly crawling out of the night. The road under his feet was neither long nor short, it was still the same as before, but the person walking had changed. If he turned back now, would it still be too late? This last thought flashed across He Yi's mind, and then he silently shook his head, expressionlessly smiling bitterly to himself in his heart. This world was so cruel, when had it ever given people like him so many choices? Since he had decided, he should go, there was no turning back. He pulled out his sword, reflecting a cold light in the night, and then stepped out. In 2 or 3 steps, he reached the side of the wall, and then jumped over. Landing noiselessly, in front of him was the bedroom in the backyard, one of which was still lit, not knowing if it had been awakened by the movement just now. He quietly walked to the bedroom door, and heard a child call out softly from inside. "Mother, I'm so sleepy." There was a gentle female voice hurriedly comforting him, with a bit of love and warmth. He could even feel the taste of beauty and happiness from it. He slightly lowered his head, looking at the long sword in his hand. The night wind was cold, blowing through his clothes and hair. His hand faintly trembled, but very quickly steadied. After a moment, he took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and went forward to gently push the door. With a low creak, the door slowly opened. Chapter 576. Lu Chen and Old Ma lived together. Of course, there was also a black dog. They had a good sleep that night, but were awakened by the explosion of fireworks on the mountain and the thunderous voice of immortal Tiehu. It was rare for a perfected cultivator of the divine transformation realm to be so angry. Not to mention that it was rarely seen, it probably would not happen once in a decade or two. Therefore, when Lu Chen and Old Ma figured out what had happened on the mountain, they were both shocked. However, after staying for a long time in the true immortal alliance where undercurrents were surging and scheming against each other, they naturally, as if instinctively, immediately thought of more things. Lu Chen frowned and thought for a while, then asked Old Ma, when was the last time an old man of the divine transformation realm got angry in public like this? Old Ma pondered for a while, then shook his head and said, I can't remember. Lu Chen glanced at him, and Old Ma asked, do you want to go up the mountain to have a look? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and said, let's go there. It's already like this, and things will definitely get out of hand. What's the use of not going there? We have to understand what happened. Of course, this was reasonable, and Old Ma also nodded in agreement. In addition, there was another reason that they did not say out loud. In fact, they both knew in their hearts that although there were a lot of outstanding cultivators in Zhengxianmeng, most of them still belonged to the top few perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm, and there were many conflicts between them. They were important figures in perfected cultivator Tianlan's faction, and it was not appropriate for them to stay out of this at this time. If perfected cultivator Tianlan asked them about this in the future, it would be very bad if they could not say anything. Therefore, the two brought Atsu, who had just been woken up and seemed a little unhappy and depressed, to Mount Celestial Dragon. The night was still very dark, but the startled people on Mount Celestial Dragon soon woke up. On the way, Lu Chen and Old Ma saw many torches and more figures. Obviously, many people had the same mentality as them. After all, this was a soul formation perfected lord's show. It would be a waste not to watch it. Regardless of whether it was useful in the future, he would have something to brag about. Therefore, when Lu Chen and Old Ma rushed to the rain listening building at the fastest speed, the small building had already been tightly surrounded by numerous people. Lu Chen pulled on Old Ma, and the two of them climbed up a big tree on the other side. Anyway, there were many people in the dark, so there was nothing to be ashamed of. However, the troublesome thing was that after they climbed up the tree, they found that the tree was already full of people. It seemed that everyone in the world was the same. Even cultivators couldn't change their curiosity and loved to watch the fun. Finally squeezing out two places to stand, Lu Chen and Old Ma were happy and immediately looked forward. As for Atsu, he didn't want to join in the fun with these stupid humans. He just lay under the tree, yawning and looking sleepy. Song Wenji. After seeing the situation in front of the rain listening building clearly, Lu Chen was startled and said with a little astonishment. Old Ma also recognized the woman who was kneeling in front of the rain-savoring building and crying very sadly. He also clearly saw Song Wenji's somewhat messy and torn clothes. Suddenly, his complexion changed slightly. Then, he glanced at the extremely frightening figure with a monstrous aura floating in the sky. He lowered his voice and said, which idiot dares to touch this woman on this mountain? Lu Chen nodded and also showed a puzzled expression. He frowned and kept looking at the rain-listening building. Suddenly, Tiehu Real Lord shouted again in midair, angrily said, perverted thief. Still not coming out to die. You dare to do it but don't dare to admit it. Everyone's eardrums were buzzing from this big shot's angry shout, and they were all shocked. Almost all the people present were cultivators, and there was no lack of cultivators who had cultivated for many years. But at a glance, almost everyone's expression changed. It was conceivable that the cultivation of a deity transformation stage immortal was really unfathomable. However, from the beginning until now, aside from Song Wenji running out of the building in tears, there was actually no movement from inside. It was unknown if the so-called pervert was scared out of his wits by the soul formation true monarch and didn't dare to come out. But everyone knew that in this situation, with immortal Tiehu blocking this small building, unless there were other deity transformation stage immortals coming out, otherwise, looking at Immortal Tiehu's furious look, there would definitely be blood splattered on the spot today. As for whether you came out or not, it didn't matter at all. Now it was just that Immortal Tiehu was unwilling to take action because of his status, but later on he would be impatient and tear down this small building, which was just a small effort. Sure enough, Immortal Tiehu, who was in mid-air, not knowing whether he was provoked by the person in the small building below, or seeing Song Wenji's pitiful appearance, after a shout, he flipped his palm. Suddenly, a huge palm shadow appeared in the sky and directly hit down on the rain-listening building. In front of the rain-listening building, Song Wenji exclaimed and covered her body with her clothes, but her feet were not slow, and she lightly dodged. Thus, under the astonished gazes of everyone, the gigantic palm image landed with a loud bang. With a ka sound, the small building was directly crushed down as if it was a piece of rotten wood, and with a loud bang, it turned into a pile of broken wood and ruins. It was crushed just like that. There was no sound from the person inside until now. If there was really someone inside, and if his cultivation was not strong enough, he probably was already dead. Outside the rain-listening building, a large number of people were dumbfounded. Everyone knew that Immortal Tiehu was very angry now, but no one expected that this old man would actually make such a heavy move. Lu Chen suddenly heard several gasps around him, and even his expression changed slightly. This move was indeed very powerful, but everyone had seen the world. Although they were usually very respectful of deity transformation stage immortals, they were not completely frightened by this move. Most of the people who could stand here today were those who could survive in Zhengxianmeng, and how many of them were fools. In a rage, he killed with one blow, and the murderer did not even have a chance to appeal. Who knew what was going on in the rain-listening building in the dark? Everyone only saw Song Wenji's tattered clothes, but there were all kinds of strange things in Zhengxianmeng, so who knew what was going on in the rain-listening building? Everyone was silent. After a while, suddenly they heard the elites of the Heavenly Law Hall in the innermost part of the crowd loudly praising. What they said was nothing more than praising Immortal Tiehu for eliminating evil for the people, upholding justice, and so on. The people on the outside looked at each other in dismay, no one answered. After a while, True Lord Taihu landed back on the ground and stood beside Song Wenji. Song Wenji let out a cry and threw herself into his arms, crying non-stop. Immortal Tiehu showed a loving expression, and comforted her in a low voice, "It's okay, it's okay." At this time, someone had already gone to check and clean the ruins of the rain-listening building. The surrounding people all looked over there, wondering who was so unlucky in the building. Lu Chen was watching attentively, and suddenly felt old Ma pulling him. He turned his head and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" Old Ma did not speak, and only pointed at their feet, which was the bottom of the big tree, with his mouth. Lu Chen looked down and saw that Chen He was standing beside Atu at some point in time. Of course he knew Atsu, so he was looking around, seemingly looking for Lu Chen, but of course he did not find him. After a while, he seemed to think of something, and looked up. Lu Chen and old Ma waved to him. Chen He smiled and nodded to them with a gentle expression. Lu Chen smiled back, and at the same time his eyes swept over Chen He's back. He could see 2 or 3 figures standing in the shadows, neither far nor near, following Chen He all the time. He smiled and did not say anything. At this time, there was a sudden commotion in front, and someone shouted in the ruins. They found a person, or to be exact, a dead person. Chapter 577. After greeting each other, Lu Chen, old Ma, and Chen He remained standing on the tree. Everyone looked away. Lu Chen had no intention of going down, and Chen He did not show any signs of climbing up the tree. After standing for a while, Chen He seemed to feel that this was not a good place, so he walked to the side and quickly walked into the crowd on the other side. The seemingly ordinary figures behind him also followed him like shadows. Seeing that those people had gone far away, old Ma softly snorted. Lu Chen frowned and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma said, "This person's ambition is not small. He is not willing to be under someone else for long. He may become a disaster in the future." Lu Chen laughed and turned to look at old Ma. He said, I didn't expect you to have mastered the mind-reading skill. Come, tell me, how did you see through it in the blink of an eye? Old Ma said seriously, we are standing on this branch, but he feels uncomfortable under it and would rather walk away. It is obvious that he is dissatisfied. Lu Chen shook his head with a smile and said, don't tell me that you're holding a grudge against him because he snatched something good from you. Of course I don't think much of him. Old Ma calmly admitted it. However, there was a solemn expression on his face as he said, it doesn't matter how he treats me. However, given your current status, if he abandons you and joins Shuang, not only will he not be punished, he will even be given great things. What will others think if they see this? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said with a slightly self-deprecating tone, they probably think that I have fallen out of favor with that damn Baldy. Old Ma snorted coldly and did not say anything. When they met by chance just now, both sides were very polite and friendly. But everyone could also feel that the atmosphere between the two was different from before. After Chen he was forced by Lu Chen to join Zheng Xianmeng's side, he could be considered a person who knew when to pick up and when to let go. He immediately joined Lu Chen's faction and worked hard for him. He also paid special attention to the matter of hunting down the evil sect. To put it nicely, it was abandoning the dark for the light. To put it bluntly, it was probably turning against him. Of course, Lu Chen's plan had pushed him too far and made him a mortal enemy of the evil sect. Chen he did not have much choice. But now that time had passed, Chen he only seemed to be friendly towards Lu Chen on the surface. Just now when he was under the tree, he even seemed a little unhappy when he raised his head to look at him. Then, if he achieved something in the future and had power and influence, when he faced Lu Chen, would he remember that Lu Chen had also plotted against him? It's so damn hard to live well in this broken place like Zheng Xianmeng, Lu Chen suddenly cursed. Old Ma sighed at the side, patted his shoulder with his hand, and then said in a low and sympathetic tone, I understand how you feel, and I sympathize with you, don't talk nonsense, the whole Sky Dragon Mountain knows that you and I are best friends. If others want to deal with me, they will probably kill you first before killing me. Lu Chen very politely interrupted Old Ma's comfort. Old Ma's expression changed greatly, and then he also cursed something like, what the hell? But these two people were people who had been in this damn Zheng Xianmeng for many years, so they quickly put aside those boring and useless emotions and began to discuss the solution later. Looking at your sneaky and thoughtful look, you must have come up with some evil idea in your mind, right? Lu Chen looked at Old Ma and said seriously. Old Ma looked at Lu Chen with contempt, and then said, the things you have done are much more ruthless than me. Anyway, since things have come to this, why not make the first move? Lu Chen didn't think much and shook his head, saying, behave yourself these days, don't mess around. Old Ma frowned and said, when he really goes far away and goes to the western continent, it will be difficult to deal with. Lu Chen said lightly, we haven't really reached the point where we are enemies of life and death. Let's wait and see, no hurry. Moreover, the Immortal Alliance has not been peaceful recently, let's wait and see first. As he said this, he seemed to think of something and looked up at the dark night sky above his head. Old Ma also seemed to understand what he meant. After a moment of silence, he also nodded and seemed to agree with Lu Chen's idea. But he still seemed to be a little unwilling. After smacking his lips twice, he suddenly said, anyway, seeing him like a villain intoxicated by success makes me uncomfortable. If I knew this day would come, I would have let that little girl White Lotus teach him a little more. By the way, I haven't seen White Lotus for a while, do you know where she went? Lu Chen said indifferently, I didn't see her either. Maybe she is still staying in Su Qingjuan's room and is too lazy to go out. Well, there seems to be a dead person carried out over there. TSK, his whole body is so soft, even his bones are broken. A deity severing is really powerful, but to be able to do this, hey. The atmosphere in the vicinity of the rain-savoring building on the Celestial Dragon Mountain had always been a little weird. Though nobody stood out to openly question Immortal Tiehu or say anything else, all the cheers and rebukes were from the people of Heavenly Law Hall, which sounded a little weird. Fortunately, Immortal Tiehu did not have the intention to be entangled here any longer. He casually said a few words like, "The perverted thief is extremely daring, provoking the Tai Sui, seeking his own death." He then brought along the beautiful and sorrowful Song Wenji and left. After this big shot left, the scene suddenly became lively. Many people squeezed forward, wanting to see who the dead person was and that there were other clues in the rain-savoring building that had been turned into ruins from time to time, so that they could find out what had happened before. That's right, even though Immortal Tiehu personally appeared to punish them and intimidate everyone, the intelligent people of the true Immortal Alliance who were used to seeing crafty plots and conspiracies still didn't really believe it on this point. Even a deity transformation stage immortal couldn't suppress his curiosity and guess. It could be seen that this was the usual atmosphere. However, although Taihu Immortal had left, the people of Heavenly Law Hall still surrounded the place and kept the corpse. Some people were dissatisfied and shouted in the crowd to show everyone which idiot had eaten a bear's heart and a leopard's heart to dare to provoke the young miss of the Heavenly Law Hall. However, the Heavenly Law Hall just turned a blind eye and directly left. The onlookers were naturally full of doubts. They only felt that the incident tonight seemed to be full of strangeness, and that something was not quite right. But since it had come to this, everyone could only gradually disperse. Lu Chen and old Ma brought Atu, who looked like he had almost fallen asleep again, back to where they came from. While they were discussing this matter in a low voice, they suddenly heard an extremely sharp howl coming from another place on the Heavenly Dragon Mountain. The faces of Lu Chen and old Ma changed at the same time. The direction from which the sound came was from Fuyunji, and it sounded like an extremely urgent alarm signal. Chapter 578. The large group of people who were about to disperse, those who were walking in the light and those who were about to disappear into the darkness, suddenly paused. It was as if someone had suddenly cast an unfathomable Tao technique and divine ability, and all the sounds were instantly erased. Everyone turned their heads and looked in the direction of the shrill alarm, which was also the direction of Fuyunji, and even Kunlun Temple, which had recently become very popular on Mount Tianlong. Lu Chen and old Ma looked at each other, and their expressions changed. The level of the alarm in Fuyunji was not low. Something big must have happened. Why is it so unpeaceful tonight? What happened in Fuyunji? Old Ma could not help but complain to Lu Chen in a low voice. Lu Chen also shook his head with a hint of caution on his face. He frowned as he looked at the gradually brightening Fuyunji's territory in the distance, and there were more lights gradually gathering in that direction. No matter what, the two of them were on the same side as Fuyunji and Lord Tianlan, so it was reasonable for them to go back and take a look. After getting down from the tree, they called Atsu and rushed to Fuyunji Temple. There were many people along the way. Obviously, they had heard the noise and ran there. Lu Chen walked quickly as he looked around. He saw that there were familiar faces and unfamiliar faces, but most of them had grave expressions. It was as if they were deeply worried about the floating clouds company, or if they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to express their goodwill. However, who would know what was really in other people's hearts? Maybe some people were burning with anxiety, maybe some people were gloating, and maybe some people just wanted to look on coldly, not caring about the big or small disasters, and only seeing if there was a chance to gain benefits. There must be all kinds of such things. For a moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt that it was a little funny. The alliance of true immortals commanded the world and was majestic. It looked extraordinary on the surface, but the people who were really in the core of the alliance of true immortals were probably already used to scheming against each other. Not knowing if it was because Lu Chen had been silent, old Ma was a little anxious. He approached him a little nervously. First, he looked around to make sure that no one was too close, and then he said in a very low voice that only Lu Chen could hear, "Could it be that something happened to Lord Zhengxiameng?" Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly stopped, and his expression changed. His sudden stop startled old Ma and Atsu. Old Ma saw that he didn't look good and quickly said, "I'm just guessing. Don't take it seriously. I'm just afraid that." Lu Chen shook his head slightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't blame you." Speaking of this, he paused for a moment, and then said calmly, "I can't think of anyone who can secretly plot against a person like the damn Baldy. He should be fine." Old Ma replied with a It seemed that he had no objection to Lu Chen's words. His expression relaxed, and then he strode forward. Lu Chen followed him, looking at Old Ma's back with a somewhat complicated expression. When Old Ma suddenly asked him this question just now, to be honest, he had never thought that something might happen to Lord Tianlan when the alarm sounded. But at that moment, his heart suddenly beat faster in his chest. Why was that? Was he worried, or was he expecting something? His sober reason had always firmly controlled his body and will, so that he knew what was the right thing to do. But in his mind and in the depths of his heart, had he ever thought about that kind of secret freedom? Had he really hoped that person would die? Lu Chen looked at the hall that was getting closer and gradually showing its outline, and suddenly quickened his pace. As the most powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, Fuyunji did not get its reputation by bragging. Its efficiency and strength were actually far better than other mountain forces. Therefore, when these people just arrived near the edge of Fuyunji's territory, they found that the situation here was not quite the same as in the rain-savoring tower. The people of Fuyunji had completely controlled the surroundings. They were heavily guarded, and the atmosphere was somber. Everyone was blocked outside. Those outsiders were blocked by the stern-looking and solemn guards of Fuyunji. Although they were dissatisfied, everyone could see that something serious must have happened in Fuyunji's territory at the moment. If there was a dispute, the arrogant soldiers of Fuyunji would not be polite and show mercy. And those who belonged to Fuyunji were quickly recognized or reported their identities. Then, they were quickly summoned and distributed to various places in an orderly manner, further strengthening the defense around Fuyunji. Therefore, this territory became more and more stable. In the dark, a large group of people were blocked outside, sticking their heads out and looking around in the silent and somber atmosphere. It was completely different from the situation in the rain-savoring tower. Lu Chen and Old Ma rushed here. After they came forward and showed their identities, they were quickly let in. With Lu Chen's identity, he was now one of the 3 core figures under Supreme Tianlan. His future was limitless. Therefore, everyone thought highly of him and naturally would not let him do the work of guarding. Lu Chen led Old Ma and Atsu directly through the crowd. Under the guidance and whispers of the people next to him, they went to the place where the incident happened. Old Ma followed him and heard a few words. His expression slowly changed into a complicated and shocked expression, and even the corners of his eyes were slightly twitching. Lu Chen kept a sullen face and did not speak. He walked quickly through the main hall of Fuyunji, but did not go in the direction of the Kunlun Hall. Instead, he took a detour in another direction. The night there looked particularly deep and dark. The wind blew from the front, carrying with it a faint smell of blood. After walking for a while, they could vaguely see a house there. There were already many people surrounding it, and there were many familiar faces among them, including Shuaiying and the other top figures of the Floating Clouds division. At this moment, they were all here. Lu Chen walked over with large strides. Hearing his footsteps, Shuaiying turned her head and glanced in his direction. When she saw Lu Chen, her charming face was as cold as ice, but she didn't show any hostility towards him. She only nodded slightly, which could be considered a greeting. Lu Chen walked to her side and was about to speak when they suddenly heard a beast-like howl from behind them. It sounded like a man's heart-wrenching cry. There was also a low sound, as if someone inside had lost control and hit the wall or knocked over something. A few fires lit up in the dark house. A commotion came, and a few voices gathered together. It seemed like they had spent a lot of effort to suppress the person who had lost control. Lu Chen and Shuang both looked over there. The wind blew past them, carrying with it a strong smell of blood. It was nauseating. Lu Chen lowered his head slightly. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth and asked, inside, Shui Ying's expression was solemn. She sighed softly and said in a low voice, very tragic. Lu Chen did not speak. The woman in front of him had seen more of the world than him. If even she said the word, very tragic, there was a moment when Lu Chen did not even want to enter this house. However, Shuang looked at him. For some reason, her gaze was somewhat deep. She said, "Shall we go in and take a look?" Lu Chen frowned and looked at her. His heart sank slightly. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, let's go in and take a look." Chapter 579. Before entering the house, Lu Chen turned around and glanced at old Ma, who was standing behind him. Atsu was also standing beside old Ma. However, this black dog was no longer as lazy and sleepy as before. Instead, its eyes were sharp and fierce. It stared at the house with a murderous look, as if it wanted to eat someone alive. He didn't know if it was stimulated by the strong smell of blood that drifted in the wind. Old Ma also looked at Lu Chen. His expression was solemn, but there was a hint of worry and anxiety in the depths of his eyes. Lu Chen shook his head slightly. Old Ma was startled for a moment, but then nodded in acknowledgement. After this short silent exchange, Lu Chen turned around and said to Shuang, "Let's go." Shuang did not say anything and walked into the house first. Lu Chen followed half a step behind her. However, just as they were about to enter the door, Lu Chen suddenly heard a few low roars from Atsu behind him. Lu Chen's body paused. He turned around to look, and his expression changed slightly. He saw that old Ma and Atsu were still standing in the same place. However, there were now 4 or 5 people around them. There was originally no one around them, but now there were 4 or 5 people around them. They seemed to be very loose, and there was no obvious hostility. However, it was true that they had surrounded them in the middle. Old Ma's expression did not change, as if he did not feel anything. However, Atsu did not hold back. They growled fiercely at the few Fuyunji people who were still a distance away from them. Lu Chen was silent for a moment. His expression was already somewhat gloomy. He turned around to look at Shuang and said, "Hall Master Shui, what is the meaning of this?" Shui Ying's expression was calm, as if she did not see anything out of the ordinary. She only said softly, "They do not have any ill intentions. It is just that this is an emergency. There must be some suspicious people. Let's just watch for now. There will be no problems." As she said this, she smiled slightly and her expression softened. In this disgusting and bloody night, she was like a beautiful flower that was pleasing to the eye, pleasing to the eye. She stretched out her hand and gestured for them to enter. She calmly smiled and said, "Let's go in and have a look. It is fine outside." Lu Chen looked at this beautiful and famous woman. He stood motionless with an indifferent expression. It was as if he had suddenly become deaf and did not hear what Shuang had just said. Of course, the 2 of them were not the only ones present. Other than old Ma, Atsu and a few people near them, Fuyunji's elite troops had already tightly surrounded this house. There were even more people at the main entrance. Although no one was too close to the 2 leaders, Shuang and Lu Chen, their every move and word was observed by the surrounding people. Therefore, at that moment, when Lu Chen suddenly disregarded Shui Ying's words rudely, the atmosphere at the scene suddenly seemed to become cold. The originally somewhat tense surroundings immediately looked over. On the stone steps, Lu Chen indifferently looked at Shuang. He did not take a step, did not move, and did not have any intention of speaking. Sometimes, not speaking actually had another meaning. Perhaps it was to express dissatisfaction. Shui Ying's expression also changed slightly. It seemed that she did not expect Lu Chen to disregard her words in front of so many people at this critical moment. Moreover, he was clearly looking at her with some provocation. This situation was clearly a little awkward. Shuang felt that she was in a difficult position. She waited for a while, then slowly retracted her extended hand. She then said indifferently, "What is it? Junior Lu, do you have any dissatisfaction with me?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "I dare not. Hall Master Shui's reputation is illustrious and her words carry enormous weight. She can do whatever she wants. She can say that whoever she wants is a suspect. she can detain and surround whoever she wants. How could I dare to be dissatisfied with such power? He said these words very clearly and loudly. In front of the main entrance of the house, who knew how many people in the open and in the dark heard these words clearly at the same time. For a moment, there was silence all around. This was probably the first time that the two great figures under Supreme Tianlan, who had always lived in harmony, suddenly erupted into a conflict. In the past many years, Shuang had been the leader of Fuyunji. She was loyal and devoted to Supreme Tianlan, and she was able to lead Fuyunji. She led this powerful and vicious force to fight against the devil cult for many years. Until now, she had almost completely defeated the devil cult and made great achievements. Before Lu Chen appeared, or more accurately, before Supreme Tianlan suddenly held a disciple acceptance ceremony and accepted Lu Chen as his only disciple, Shuang was fully deserving of being Supreme Tianlan's #1 confidant. After that disciple acceptance ceremony, who knew how many people on Mount Celestial Dragon and in Zhengxianmeng were watching Fuyunji and Shuang? They were full of interest to see how this woman would react. After all, in terms of status, the person who was most likely to inherit Supreme Tianlan's great legacy had suddenly changed from her to the man called Lu Chen. This was a bitter fruit, and it was almost impossible to swallow. Perhaps a conflict was inevitable, but to everyone's surprise, Shuang seemed to have no objections, or rather, she accepted everything without any change in expression. During the disciple acceptance ceremony, she followed behind Supreme Tianlan with a smile, doing everything she was supposed to do. On normal days, she and Lu Chen coordinated and adapted to each other, and finally destroyed the last of the devil cult's forces in the immortal city. No one could not help but praise her, and they could not help but sigh at how unfathomable this woman's thoughts were. Until today, she seemed to have finally begun to lose her patience. Facing Lu Chen's somewhat unexpected provocation, she seemed to no longer have the good attitude she had in the past. Junior brother Lu. Shui Ying's voice also carried a bit of coldness. She said indifferently, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm just doing things according to the rules. Now that something has happened in this house, the investigation naturally has to first investigate the suspect and motive. What's wrong with that? Is it worth it for you to humiliate me like this? She looked at Lu Chen, and straightened her back and waist. Just like how she had walked through this dangerous world of men for so many years, she was proud and fearless. She said in a clear voice, looks like, it's not that I've done anything wrong, but that you already don't like me, and are somewhat dissatisfied with me, right? The surrounding Fuyunji people mostly stood expressionlessly, their heads lowered, or looking into some unknown dark place. If it was possible, there probably weren't many among them who were willing to stand here and listen to these two people start to show off their abilities. And that woman, at this moment, looked like a sword that was slowly being unsheathed. Cold light flashed, and the sharpness gradually revealed, causing people's hearts to palpitate. However, when Lu Chen looked over, he didn't seem to feel anything. In front of Shui Ying's imposing manner, he also didn't seem to have any intention of retreating. He stared fixedly at Shui Ying. After a while, he suddenly opened his mouth and said something that didn't make sense. He said, have you acknowledged him as your master? Shui Ying was startled, and then subconsciously shook her head. Before she could speak, she saw Lu Chen standing there, his gaze suddenly sharp, like a knife that wanted to cut people's hearts, to prick the hidden wounds, to flip over the bloody places and show them to the public. He opened his mouth coldly, and each word was like a flying dagger as he said, then what gives you the right to call me junior brother Lu? Do you have the right? He said calmly and coldly. In the night, everyone, including old Ma, was stunned at that moment. Then, they subconsciously held their breath, leaving only a deathly silence. Chapter 580. On this night, the conflict between Lu Chen and Shui Ying had come without warning. Furthermore, the intensity of the conflict had exceeded everyone's expectations. In almost an instant, the two most capable subordinates of Supreme Lord Tianlan, who were also the most likely to inherit his legacy, had shed all pretenses of cordiality and directly confronted each other. Of course, although the situation had become unusually tense, if one were to trace back to the source, the biggest reason for the situation to escalate was because Lu Chen had unceremoniously pointed out Shuang. Furthermore, he had done so in front of so many people, most of whom were Fuyunji's subordinates. Faced with Lu Chen's accusation, Shuang could not back down at all. She could only retaliate. In fact, the conflict had been manageable at the beginning. However, Lu Chen seemed determined to blow things up tonight. Especially after he had said that heart-wrenching sentence about whether or not Shuang was qualified, the situation had completely gone out of control. Shui Ying's abilities were extremely strong. Regardless of whether it was in terms of cultivation or in leading a large organization like the Floating Clouds Division, she had always proven herself to be an outstanding leader. She had always been publicly acknowledged as the second most powerful person under True Lord Tianlan. However, everyone in the world knew one fact: although Supreme Lord Tianlan was talented and bold, and his name shook the world, he had never accepted a disciple. Shuang was Supreme Lord Tianlan's subordinate. She was his right-hand man and his trusted aide. However, she was not a disciple of Supreme Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen was only a latecomer. However, Lu Chen was a disciple who had held a disciple ceremony and was personally acknowledged by Supreme Lord Tianlan. He was known by all of Zhengxianmeng, and even the whole world, as the person who would inherit Supreme Lord Tianlan's legacy in the future. This was a difference in status. This was a completely different fate. It seemed rather cruel. Do you have the right? Under the night sky, a deathly stillness enveloped the front of the house. Although there was no sound, Lu Chen's mocking and straightforward words still seemed to reverberate in this place, like a whip, fiercely lashing at Shui Ying's face. Shuang did not have the right to call Lu Chen junior brother Lu. No matter how old she was in Fuyunji and how powerful she was still not true Lord Tianlan's disciple and successor. She was just a subordinate, she was just an outsider. In the past, Lu Chen didn't express any objection or disdain towards this form of address. This wasn't a big deal, but now, it seemed like he was going to bring this matter up in front of everyone tonight and slap Blood Warbler in the face. He succeeded. At that moment, Blood Warbler was speechless, and the surrounding people held their breaths in silence. Even those who were the most loyal to Blood Warbler in Fuyunji stood in place and did not move. Everyone knew that although Lu Chen was despicable, and although his words were so straightforward and hurtful, his words were not wrong. Amidst the cold silence, a man slowly walked out from an inconspicuous corner behind the crowd. He looked at the man and woman standing in the center of the field from afar. It was He Yi. Lu Chen's words just now seemed to echo in his heart and mind, reminding him that he had once been in the same awkward situation as Blood Warbler today. He was clearly only one step away, and if that high and mighty lord agreed to take him in as a disciple, then everything would be different. At that moment, he suddenly felt that he was very similar to Blood Warbler. They had both done their utmost to serve true Lord Tianlan, and they had both risked their lives for him. They were both so outstanding that most people recognized them, and they were only one step away from the peak in their hearts. Just that one step was like the difference between heaven and earth. He Yi's gaze was a little dark and uncertain. He let out a soft sigh and seemed to have thought of something. The corners of his mouth slightly curled up, as if he was secretly happy and pleased with his choice. In front of the house, Blood Warbler naturally did not know that there was a person called He Yi who actually appreciated her in his heart. Of course, even if she knew, she would not feel any gratitude towards him. It was more likely that she would snort disdainfully. She was a proud woman. In order to prove her excellence, she had worked very hard all these years. She had done her best, and the results were also pretty much the best, except for the fact that she had not been able to catch that hateful elder ghost. Also, except for the lord whom she had followed loyally for many years. Although he had given her power, fame, and a position that everyone admired, he had never taken her in as his disciple. She had once thought that everything would come naturally, and that this was just a test from the Lord True Lord. Or perhaps there was something that she had not done well enough. After all, a godlike figure like true Lord Tianlan had such a vast and magnificent foundation. If she wanted to become his successor, she would definitely have to be even more outstanding. That was why Blood Warbler had never complained. She had only worked hard to make herself more outstanding, so that she could build his empire for him. Until one day, a person called Lu Chen appeared and became his disciple. And now, this Lu Chen, who had snatched away all of her hopes, had coldly asked her this question in front of her. Do you have the qualifications? This was the sharpest knife that Blood Warbler had ever heard or seen in her life. When it pierced into her chest, that kind of pain felt as if all the decades of suppression had been triggered in an instant, and then exploded out, wanting to tear her entire body apart, throwing everything that she had once treasured onto the ground and trampling on it. It made her wish she was dead, and made her wish she was dead. It turned out that all these years had been for naught. Her face was deathly pale, and her lips were trembling slightly. She stared fixedly at Lu Chen. If looks could kill, then Lu Chen would definitely have died 100 times. Unfortunately, he could not. She slowly raised her hand and pointed at Lu Chen. Word by word, it was as if all the anger in her body was gathered in that one word. You, actually, dare, like this. Even now, Lu Chen still had no intention of backing down. He looked coldly at this extremely angry woman and said, "Today's matter is not your chance. Don't even think of using this against me or my people." After saying this, he turned and walked down the stone steps. Under everyone's gaze, he walked all the way to the side of Old Ma and Black Dog. Then, he swept his gaze across the faces of the people surrounding him. His gaze was a little cold, and there was a hint of provocation in it. However, the people opposite him all avoided his gaze. After a moment of stalemate, they slowly retreated into the darkness. Standing in front of the house, Blood Warbler's face became even paler. Atsu moved his head to Lu Chen's side and rubbed against his leg. Old Ma's expression was still solemn, but it could be seen that he was relieved. However, when he walked to Lu Chen's side, he hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, "It's not worth it for you to shed all pretense of cordiality like this." Lu Chen did not look at him. He just turned around and said lightly, "After so many years, I only have you as my subordinate. Although you're useless, I can't just let you be harmed by others." Old Ma looked at him for a while, then nodded and smiled. Then, he puffed out his chest and followed behind Lu Chen. Together with the majestic and grimacing Atsu, they once again walked towards the house. Blood Warbler was still standing there, but this time, Lu Chen did not even look at her. He just walked past her and strode into the house that was filled with the thick smell of blood. Only Blood Warbler was left. Under the strange gazes of the crowd, she stood alone at the door. Chapter 581. Lu Chen and Shuang actually did not make a move until the very end. At the end of the day, the two of them were just using their mouths and not their fists. They could still leave some leeway if they argued and ridiculed each other too much, but if they really fought without caring about anything else, the situation would be completely out of control. The two of them would no longer have a way out. It could even be said that if they fought, they would not leave any leeway for Supreme Lord Tianlan, who had yet to show himself. If it really came to that, Supreme Lord Tianlan could only choose between the two of them and completely give up on the other. The word "give up" here basically meant that one would never be able to make a comeback. To put it simply, it was probably the word death. Lu Chen was a smart person. He could acutely sense that Shuang seemed to be intentionally using this sudden incident to attack the prestige and influence of his side. Although it was obscure, there was a hint of sharpness in it. Therefore, he made a judgment in an instant and directly exposed the conflict between the two of them in an attempt to provoke Shuang. Shuang was also a smart person. She had been arrogant for so many years in power. Apart from the few divine transformation true lords in Zhengxianmeng, when had she ever lowered her head to anyone? But this time, she actually managed to forcefully endure it until the very end. In the end, the two of them did not cross that line. The footsteps gradually faded away. It seemed like Lu Chen had already brought Old Ma and Atsu into the house. However, Shuang was still standing at the main entrance. It had been many years since anyone had dared to reprimand and ridicule her like this. This was quite a loss of face. She looked around and swept her gaze across those people. At this time, even more people had gathered. Most of them were from Fuyunji, while some were from Supreme Lord Tianlan's faction. For example, there were also quite a few from the Kunlun party. They could all be considered as her own people. However, the more people there were, the more intense the burning sensation on his face seemed to be. Other than that, so many people had seen this scene. Although no one dared to look her in the eye at this moment, and most people looked away or lowered their eyes when her eyes swept across, Shuang knew clearly that as long as the sun rose, the entire Celestial Dragon Mountain, the entire Zhengxianmeng, would probably know what had happened here tonight. It was impossible to keep this information a secret. Someone would definitely leak it out, and it was very likely that more than one person would. There were no secrets in Zhengxianmeng. She suddenly felt a little tired, and also a little lost. When she swept her gaze across the crowd just now, she clearly saw that in the eyes of these Fuyunji subordinates who were usually loyal to her, there were shock, doubt, anger, sympathy, and all sorts of other emotions. However, there was only one thing that she had secretly hoped for in the depths of her heart. Yes, these elite troops who would normally risk their lives because of a word or order from her, in tonight's conflict, almost all of them had unanimously chosen to stay out of it. Not a single person stood up for her, shouted for her, or attacked her in anger because of her humiliation. Perhaps if something like that really happened, she would berate and stop them, but she did not. From that moment on, Shuang understood one thing. Even though she had worked hard for so many years, even though she had given everything she had to Fuyunji, Fuyunji did not belong to her. Fuyunji would forever belong to the high and mighty true Lord Tianlan. Because of this, when she and Lu Chen had a fierce conflict, although she was still the leader of Fuyunji, no one in Fuyunji stood up to support her. Everyone watched from the sidelines because they knew that what Lu Chen had said was not wrong. Lu Chen had the status of master and disciple, but Shuang did not. Indeed, Shuang did not have the right to call him that. In other words, everyone present was a smart person. No one would have guessed that after true Lord Tianlan passed away, there would only be one person who would inherit this magnificent foundation. No one stood up to support her. In that instant, Shuang felt as if all the strength in her body had been sucked out. She silently looked up at the sky. The night was dark, and a trace of pain flashed through her eyes. Why was this? Decades of kindness and loyalty still could not be exchanged for that person's pity? In what way could she not compare to Lu Chen? People said that true Lord Tianlan was omnipotent and omniscient. If this was true, then why hadn't he shown up until now? Was he trying to make something clear or hint at something? Shuang slowly turned around and walked into the house with some difficulty. It was hard to imagine that not long ago, she was still in high spirits and full of ambition, ready to show off her skills. But now, she seemed to have suddenly fallen into a predicament. Had she underestimated Lu Chen, or had she misjudged Tianlan? Behind the crowd, he stared at the beautiful woman in front of the gate and frowned slightly. A trace of sympathy seemed to flash through his eyes. He then shook his head gently, sighed, and looked away. This night seemed to be especially long. Even now, it was still dark, and there was no sign of dawn. The smell of blood kept drifting from the front, nauseating and disgusting. Lu Chen and Old Ma both frowned. The two of them were not good people, and they had seen some very tragic things. But no matter what, this kind of thing was never pleasant. It was very peaceful along the way. The people of Fuyunji had already completely controlled this place, but almost no one spoke. Only the faint cries of pain in the distance seemed to emit a desolate atmosphere. The road, the walls, and even the flower corridors and other places were very clean. The Azura Hell, the scene of mountains of corpses and seas of blood, had not appeared yet. But this did not make Lu Chen and Old Ma feel any more relaxed. There was no one on the road, but the atmosphere was still so strong. Then, the situation in the place where something really happened could be imagined. Seeing that there was no one nearby, Old Ma suddenly walked 2 steps faster and came to Lu Chen's side, walking side by side. Lu Chen turned his head and glanced at him with a gloomy face. Old Ma stared at him. After a while, he finally could not help but grab his hand. The two of them stopped and stood still. Old Ma lowered his voice and said bitterly, "This has nothing to do with you, right?" Lu Chen looked at him silently and said after a moment, "Do you think it is possible for me to do such a thing?" Old Ma gritted his teeth and said, "I believe you did not do it, but we both know in our hearts that as long as you harden your heart, maybe you will do it." Lu Chen snorted and said, "I just did it to save you. Don't you know that?" "I know." Old Ma said flatly, "I am very grateful and gratified, but I want you to tell me that you did not do it for revenge." Lu Chen looked at him quietly. After a while, he nodded and said calmly, "I did not do it." Old Ma suddenly felt relieved and let out a long sigh. Then he smiled bitterly and said, "That's good, that's good. It's not far ahead, let's go and have a look." As he said, his face looked a bit bitter and sympathetic. He whispered, listening to that voice, "Chen he seems to be going crazy." "I don't know, what happened?" Lu Chen glanced at him and said nothing. He just walked forward. In the smell of blood, they walked to the bedroom in the backyard. Then they saw Chen He, who had just greeted them with a smile outside the Tingyu building not long ago. That man fell to the ground in the courtyard and looked in the direction of a bedroom. His whole body was twitching and trembling, crying and wailing, as if he had suddenly broken down. Standing around the courtyard were a dozen or so members of the Floating Clouds Agency. Every single one of them had an ugly expression on their faces. Lu Chen and Old Ma's eyes immediately fell on the bedroom door that was half closed. At the same time, footsteps sounded again. It was Shuang, with a cold face, who had also come here. They looked at the bedroom together. Then, they could sense a strong smell of blood surging out from it. Lu Chen stood where he was for a moment and then walked over. Under everyone's gaze, he slowly walked to the door of the bedroom alone. Then, he gently pushed open the half-closed door and glanced into the room. Old Ma looked at him from behind and could vaguely feel that at that moment, Lu Chen's body seemed to stiffen. After a while, Lu Chen slowly took 2 steps back and turned around. This time, his gaze fell on Chen He, who was lying on the ground. Everyone in the courtyard, including Shuang, looked at him with a somewhat complicated expression. But Lu Chen turned a blind eye to these gazes from the outside. He walked to Chen He's side. Chen He seemed to have no feelings for him at all and was only wailing with a hoarse voice. Lu Chen stretched out his palm and patted his shoulder. After a while, he said, "First, restrain your grief and accept your fate." After a while, he opened his mouth again and said, "This matter will not end like this. We will definitely give you an explanation." When he said this last sentence, his voice was a little louder. Almost everyone in the courtyard heard it. Chapter 582. In the end, the bedroom in that house was tightly sealed by the people of Fuyunji. Only a few people went in and saw what happened inside, but the truth of what happened inside was quickly spread. In this regard, Fuyunji did not strictly control the situation. One reason was that there were too many people present, and it was indeed difficult to completely prevent the news from leaking. The other reason was that at this point, if they kept suppressing the news, it would instead make it seem strange and strange. In fact, even if they did not get close to the bedroom with the strong smell of blood and did not see what was happening inside, as long as they saw the owner of the house, Chen He, scream and howl after entering the house, and then fall to the ground in pain as if he had gone mad, they could more or less guess the truth. That was the master's bedroom, not a place to keep animals, and it was impossible for pigs and sheep to be slaughtered in there. It was almost self-evident what such a strong smell of blood meant. Looking at Chen He's reaction, the truth was almost on the verge of being revealed. But, why did he do this? This was the question in the hearts of most people, and on this night, another dispute suddenly occurred between the two powerful figures of true Lord Tianlan's faction, Lu Chen and Shuang, which also somewhat lessened the horrifying and sorrowful atmosphere. After the incident, the reason for the dispute between these two people was also spread. Although the source of the rumor could not be found, the rumor was very clear. In this dispute, Lu Chen was the one who tore all pretenses of cordiality, but it seemed that the cause of the matter was first provoked by Shuang. Shuang seemed to have grown suspicious of Lu Chen and his closest subordinate, Old Ma. She did not dare to directly touch Lu Chen, but wanted to detain Old Ma in an attempt to do something. In the end, Lu Chen turned hostile on the spot and fought back forcefully, even directly mocking Shui Ying's identity and status. In a short period of time, he directly tore apart the coat of harmony between the two of them, revealing the true situation of the two of them being as incompatible as fire and water. This was what it meant to suddenly stop playing and flip the table in anger. To be honest, many people did not understand why Lu Chen did this, including a large number of other forces in Zhengxianmeng and a large number of people in Fuyunji. However, what was strange was that perfected Lord Tianlan, who had supreme power and prestige in Fuyunji, did not show up until the end of the night. Chen He, who surrendered to Zhengxianmeng, abandoned the dark side of the evil cult for the light and then turned against them, was once a tough man who could not be subdued by force or corrupted by wealth. Faced with Zhengxianmeng's terrifying means in Fuyunji, he could still withstand it and did not betray the evil cult and elder ghost. Until the end, Lu Chen used the strategy of attacking his heart and sowing discord, threatening him with the lives of Chen He's family, and letting Chen He know that the evil cult had given up on him and regarded him as an enemy. Only then did Chen He painfully abandon his past and pledge loyalty to the righteous. However, all of this now seemed to have become a farce and a joke, full of sarcasm and ridicule. Chen He had once disregarded everything for the safety of his family, and would rather betray the first half of his life. But now, right under his eyes, on the so-called safest place in the world, on Mount Celestial Dragon, where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located, all of his family, wife, and children were forever left in that dark bedroom, never to come out again. It was said that their deaths were very, very tragic, with a lot of blood flowing. This was also the reason why the smell of blood was unusually strong that night. After Chen He saw that scene, he collapsed, but he did not completely go crazy. After crying in pain for a night, this man gradually woke up the next day and ran directly to the outside of the majestic Kunlun main hall. Just like that, he knelt straight on the stone steps in front of the main hall. Without saying a word, he knelt on the ground, and then knelt like that for a day and a night. During this time, many people came to persuade him, Shuang, Lu Chen, those acquaintances from Fuyunji and so on. They all came to persuade him to take care of his body, and that revenge had to be planned in the long run. But Chen He just did not listen, and just knelt on the ground stiffly. His face was very pale, and there was almost no blood. Anyone could see that this man at this moment was just holding on with his last breath. If there was even the slightest movement, he would not be able to bear it. So no matter who it was, at this moment, no one dared to act recklessly. Of course, there might be some people who looked sad on the surface and advised him, but in their hearts, they were happy. No one could persuade Chen He to leave. In addition, this matter had gradually spread. After sending people to persuade him several times to no avail, Supreme Tianlan finally had no choice but to appear outside the main hall and appease Chen He in a pleasant manner. Chen He did not have any other request, and only said 2 words, revenge. Supreme Tianlan agreed. But in Zhengxianmeng, after that day, there was a kind of dark and unclear criticism secretly spreading. It was said that the high and mighty bald Supreme Tianlan did not immediately agree to this natural request, but hesitated. After a while, he reluctantly agreed. Why was this? There must be a reason for this abnormality. Almost all the other forces in Zhengxianmeng paid attention to this point. On the contrary, no one actually paid attention to Supreme Tiehu of Heaven's Law Hall, who was the first to make a fuss that night. Supreme Tiehu was an old and powerful supreme, and Heaven's Law Hall was indeed a great hall with a long history. But now, it was the era of Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji. Why does the old man Tianlan have concerns? Could it be that there are other secrets in this matter that we don't know? In the main hall of Heaven's Law Hall, when only Supreme Tiehu and Song Wenji were left, Song Wenji saw that there was no one around and asked Supreme Tiehu this question in her heart. Supreme Tiehu frowned slightly, and seemed to have thought about this for a long time. In the end, he said in a low voice, "Now it seems that it is not that the unfound murderer is difficult to deal with, but that he has some concerns about the dispute between his two subordinates." Song Wenji's eyes flashed slightly, and she raised her eyebrows, saying, "Lu Chen and Shuang?" True Lord Tiehu nodded his head. With his hands clasped behind his back, he walked 2 steps around the main hall and said, "I heard that Shuang had wanted to detain Lu Chen's most trusted subordinate that night." Unexpectedly, it triggered a strong reaction from Lu Chen, causing him to shed all pretenses of cordiality. At that time, I was thinking that there seemed to be something wrong with the reaction of that young man named Lu Chen. Song Wenji replied with a and said, "Yes, before this, he has been tolerating to get along with Shuang. This is also a prudent way to preserve the past. After all, he is the only disciple of Supreme Tianlan. In the future, as long as there are no accidents, this foundation will naturally be inherited by him. There is no benefit in having a conflict with Shuang now." Supreme Tiehu glanced at her, and said, "Exactly, this is the way of a smart person. First endure and wait for the right time, and then plan for the long term." But that Lu Chen just had to put aside the past, and insist on falling out with Shuang. In my opinion, the problem lies in Shuang suddenly detaining his subordinate. Song Wenji said, "Is there a problem with his subordinate?" Supreme Tiehu thought for a while, and slowly shook his head, saying, "Shuang did this, perhaps, to take the opportunity to create trouble, and put the name of the murderer on Lu Chen's head. After all, Supreme Tianlan is still alive, and it is not impossible for him to replace his disciple in the future." Song Wenji slowly nodded, and did not speak, but a strange light flashed in the depths of her eyes. At this moment, Supreme Tiehu sneered, as if he was somewhat disdainful of this matter, and was unwilling to say more. He changed the topic to Song Wenji, and said, "That person has done a good job. Make the arrangements, I will come and see him in a few days." Song Wenji was shocked, and said, "Godfather, you have already completely trusted him?" Supreme Tiehu laughed, and stroked his white beard, and said, "This time, the effect of the proof of allegiance is better than I expected." "Enough, enough." He slightly narrowed his eyes, and said, "One day, I will let that baldy suffer." Chapter 583. Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen to come over. After dismissing his attendants, they were the only ones left in the huge Kunlun Hall. What was different from the past was that Perfected Lord Tianlan even asked someone to close the door of the hall this time. When the heavy door was closed, it cut off all the noises outside and the prying eyes in the dark. Only the master and disciple were left. It seemed that the matter this time was very serious. True Lord Tianlan seemed to be very angry. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mocked Lu Chen with sarcastic words like, "You've grown wings," after he arrived. Then, when he dismissed the others, his voice was like thunder, striking fear in people's hearts. Lu Chen didn't argue in front of everyone. Perhaps facing such a famous and powerful Perfected Lord Master, anyone would feel great pressure. After all, a word from Perfected Lord Tianlan could make countless people bleed. When everyone left and the magnificent hall quieted down, Lu Chen slowly raised his head and looked forward. He saw the bald Perfected Lord's anger fade away. He frowned slightly and sat down casually on the ground in front of him. Dressed in a loose robe, he looked like a deity or Buddha. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at Lu Chen and waved his hand. "Come here." Lu Chen walked over quietly and sat down in front of him. Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and asked, "Did you do it?" Lu Chen shook his head decisively and said firmly, "No." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment and his expression softened a little, but he still looked angry. He said, "Okay, then tell me, if you were the leader of Fuyunji and encountered such a thing, who do you think would have the most motive to kill Chen He's wife and children?" Lu Chen frowned and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. He didn't speak immediately. Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly, "Just say what I want you to say. Wasn't it always like this in the past? Or is it that now that you've officially become my disciple, you're feeling apprehensive and don't dare to speak your mind?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment before he gently exhaled and nodded. "All right." Perfected Lord Tianlan grinned. His expression seemed to have become much gentler, causing the quiet surroundings of the hall to no longer be so stiff and cold. He asked again in a calm voice, "Then tell me, if we don't talk about the evidence and only talk about the evidence, who is the most suspicious?" "Old Ma," Lu Chen said. The hall seemed to fall silent for a moment. Even with Perfected Lord Tianlan's experience, he could not help but cast a sidelong glance at Lu Chen. There was a scrutinizing look in his eyes. After a while, he said, "Ma Xiaoyun? You actually think it's him?" Lu Chen's expression was calm as he said, originally, he was eager to leave the immortal city and use the mission of going to the western continent to chase after the remnants of the devil cult to roam free for a while. Originally, there was no problem, but later on, you and Shuang arranged for this matter to be handed over to Chen He. It's inevitable that he's dissatisfied. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "That makes sense. But I guess you're going to say, but next." "But," Lu Chen said, "it can't be him." Perfected Lord Tianlan asked, "Why?" Lu Chen said, "When the incident happened, he was with me the entire time. There was no time for him to commit murder. Besides, Old Ma is not brave and his cultivation is shallow. He can't do such a violent and cruel thing." Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered, looking a little disapproving. However, he did not refute Lu Chen and only said, "According to what you said, it's not him. Then who else is there to suspect?" "There are a few more." Lu Chen politely pointed at himself and said, "According to Shuang and Hall Master Shue's thoughts, I'm probably a very big suspect." This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan really laughed and looked at him with interest. After sizing him up, he nodded and said with a smile, "I think so too. You're a ruthless and meticulous person. You're not on good terms with Shuang, and Chen He abandoned you to rely on her. Also, Ma Xiaoyun is also your most trusted subordinate. Even if you did it to establish your own prestige, it seems very suspicious, not to mention for Ma Xiaoyun. You're right, but unfortunately it's not me." Lu Chen looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "If you still want to ask, I was with Old Ma that night. I didn't have time to do this." Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment, then laughed and sighed, "You're getting more and more shameless, I'm just telling the truth. If I did it, I'll admit it. If I didn't do it, I didn't do it." Lu Chen said. "All right, I believe you." Perfected Lord Tianlan actually admitted this without hesitation and said, "But you have to explain to me now. Why did you have to shed all pretense of cordiality with Shuang that night? Don't you know how difficult this is for me?" Lu Chen wanted to say something but stopped. He looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said with some surprise, "Why aren't you asking about who the murderer is?" "Nonsense." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little annoyed and said with some contempt, "Who has the leisure to care about the life and death of a few irrelevant people? The death of Chen He's wife and child is nothing to me. Seriously, it's you and Shuang who are causing trouble for me. Don't be so long-winded and tell me clearly." Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he sighed and said, "So that's what you think? It's a little scary just thinking about it. If I were to sit in your position in the future, would I become as cold-blooded and heartless as you?" "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded with certainty and said, "Brat, you are already as cold-blooded and heartless as me. If you succeed in your cultivation in the future and achieve great things, you will definitely walk through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Calling you cold-blooded and heartless is definitely not enough to describe you." Lu Chen's face darkened. He glared at Perfected Lord Tianlan and suddenly scolded, "Scram, don't curse me." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and seemed to be very happy. It was rare to see him so happy. He chuckled and said, "Are you angry? But you are angry. Is it because you still think that what I said is very likely to be right? It's just that you can't stand it." Lu Chen took a deep breath and no longer paid attention to this damned Baldy's provocation. After calming himself down, he told Perfected Lord Tianlan about his quarrel with Shuang that night. "In the end," he said, "Shuang was clearly dissatisfied with my sudden rise in power and wanted to make use of the opportunity to make me lose face. If she could use some methods to make old Ma confess under torture, if she couldn't, your decision to make me your successor would be shaken." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and said, "So you fell out with her on the spot?" Lu Chen said, "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and said, "Are you so sure that I will definitely protect you? Shuang has the entire Fuyunji behind her and she is also loyal to me. Why should I?" Lu Chen thought about it and said, "I think that Shuang herself is the third possible murderer." Perfected Lord Tianlan was taken aback and his expression changed slightly. He said, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen said, "You just said that evidence doesn't matter. In that case, she has benefited the most from this incident and is naturally suspicious." He looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "So? You know that what I said makes sense. Shuang deliberately framed me. This is something that she would do. As long as you let me investigate her, of course, you have to give me the authority and remove her from the position in Fuyunji. In less than 5 days, I will definitely give you an explanation." "No." Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly interrupted him. Lu Chen was stunned and stopped talking. Perfected Lord Tianlan said slowly, "In the future, my foundation will be yours. But for now, I won't allow you to touch her." Lu Chen stared at Perfected Lord Tianlan. After a while, he asked, "Why? Why is it that for the past few decades, out of all the extraordinary people under you, she is the only one that you respect and trust?" Chapter 584. Why couldn't he touch Shuang? There were probably many possible answers to this question. For example, most people could think that Shuang had followed Supreme Lord Tianlan for many years and had always been loyal to him. Or perhaps she had made great contributions and done countless things for Supreme Lord Tianlan. She had worked hard for him and built a solid foundation for his current foundation. Those who were quick-witted or had many schemes in their minds could probably think that perhaps after so many years, as Supreme Lord Tianlan's most capable subordinate, Shuang was in charge of such a powerful and terrifying force like Fuyunji. Fuyunji had always been famous for its shadows. No one knew how many secrets Shuang knew or was hiding. Among these secrets, were there any secrets related to Supreme Lord Tianlan's dark side? Could there be something that she could use against him? These guesses were mostly in line with everyone's thoughts. However, whether or not they were the truth, Lu Chen didn't know. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't tell him and he didn't ask. After Supreme Lord Tianlan clearly told him not to touch Shuang, he didn't say a word about this matter. However, at this point, there didn't seem to be anything else to say. Supreme Lord Tianlan knew what he wanted to know and Lu Chen also understood Supreme Lord Tianlan's attitude. The two of them each took what they needed. Therefore, not long after, Lu Chen stood up and bid farewell, leaving the Grand Hall of Kunlun. When he left, he even brought the door of the hall with him. Therefore, after a moment of light shone in, the hall returned to its somewhat gloomy and dim state. The only difference was that instead of the two people just now, Supreme Lord Tianlan's figure was now alone. He indeed seemed to have a somewhat lonely aura. Supreme Lord Tianlan stared in the direction of the door. After a while, he suddenly sighed softly. His sigh sounded a little melancholy. It wasn't loud, but it was exceptionally clear in this quiet hall. It was also at this moment that another voice suddenly rang out in this hall. It was deep and rich, like thunder rolling slowly in the dark clouds. "Your disciple is very good. Why are you sighing?" Supreme Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he was not surprised by the sudden appearance of this voice. However, he frowned slightly at its words and said, "It's rare that you would actually praise a mortal like him." As he spoke, Supreme Lord Tianlan reached into his bosom and took out a shining golden seal. It was the Kunlun seal that he had given to Lu Qin to go to the western continent. The golden radiance of the Kunlun seal gradually brightened, emitting dazzling rays of light. Not long after, a screen of light was formed in front of true Lord Tianlan, reflecting his face with a hint of gold. Needless to say, his big bald head was even reflecting some golden light. Amidst the solemnity and majesty, he revealed a rare comical look. Of course, there were no outsiders here to see this scene. However, even if someone did see this scene, probably no one would dare to make fun of this person. The screen of light condensed in midair like a wall of water. It undulated and then gradually calmed down. In the end, when the golden light quieted down, a black shadow appeared behind the light. Its appearance was blurry, but from the voice and the general outline of the shadow, it should be the black dragon that Lu Qin had seen in the depths of the sky and clouds in the forbidden area of Kunlun. Although the dragon behind the shadow seemed to be just an illusion, its disdainful aura seemed to be able to pass through the screen of light. When facing Supreme Lord Tianlan, it more or less restrained itself, but it still seemed to be a little condescending. It said indifferently, "That person is not bad. He's very much like you when you were young." Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head and stared at the black dragon. After a moment of silence, he said, "You're right." The black dragon shook its huge head as if it was stretching its body. At the same time, it said to Supreme Lord Tianlan, "But he actually left just like that. I thought that at this point, he would make you support him even more openly." Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "He won't. Lu Qin is a smart person. Previously, he said a lot of things to me, including his argument with Shuang, but it was all nonsense. He had already obtained what he wanted to hear the most. That's why he left so decisively and didn't care about Shuang at all." "What is it?" the black dragon asked. Supreme Lord Tianlan said, "He wanted me to clearly tell him that this foundation will be passed on to him in the future." The black dragon snorted and seemed to be somewhat disdainful. "That's what you said, but did he dare to believe it?" It looked down at perfected Lord Tianlan and said with a hint of mockery, "I'm sure he doesn't know what you've done in the past. It's not that hard for you to go back on your word." Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't get angry at the black dragon's sharp words, nor did he try to deny it. He only pondered for a moment, then said, "He believes me." The black dragon laughed as if it had heard something funny. "Looks like this young man is as stupid as me. He's the second person in the world who dares to trust you so much." Supreme Lord Tianlan glanced at the black dragon and smiled. "Although you haven't lived a good life these years, even you can't deny that I've done what I promised you back then, right?" The black dragon sneered and looked a little mocking, but he didn't deny it. "Others might not know, but I know how you got your current position." "What? Don't tell me that you can say with a clear conscience that you'll completely keep your promise to that young man." Supreme Lord Tianlan fell silent. The mockery in the black dragon's eyes intensified. It shook its body and the golden light on the Kunlun seal shook for a moment, then gradually retracted. Its huge figure gradually became blurry, but its voice still came through the screen of light. "You don't have to pretend in front of me. That young man will just be another sacrifice for you in the future." As the deep voice gradually faded, the golden light disappeared completely and the Kunlun seal returned to normal, falling back into Supreme Lord Tianlan's hand. Supreme Lord Tianlan clenched and relaxed his hand, putting the seal back into his pocket. He sat on the spot for a while longer, then silently stood up, walked to the door of the hall, and opened it. A gust of wind blew in from outside the hall. Supreme Lord Tianlan narrowed his eyes. He stood in the wind, his sleeves fluttering. After a long time, he suddenly smiled. There was a hint of profoundness and vicissitudes in his smile, as well as a hint of carefreeness and arrogance. With his hands behind his back, he looked at the world and said, "So what if I kept my promise to him?" Boom! Suddenly, there was a rumble in the sky. It seemed to be echoing in the sky, but it also seemed like the heavens were responding to his words. Surprised, Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head to look. At the same time, the mortals in the world looked up and saw a sudden change in the sky. Rays of light crisscrossed, and not long after, a sea of blood came crashing down, covering the sky and covering the earth. Moreover, this time, it seemed to have pushed over at least 80% of the sky. The rare phenomenon of the Crimson Sea appeared once again. Chapter 585. The phenomenon of a sea of blood that suddenly appeared enveloped the sky above Mount Heavenly Dragon and even the entire enormous city once more. Moreover, it was even more ferocious this time, and it blotted out the sun, leaving behind less than 20% of the sky that wasn't drowned by the sea of blood. And no matter how one looked at it, the last bit of space seemed to be swallowed by the blood sea at any time. This was the human world, the place where the human race had lived and multiplied for countless years. From ancient times to the present, people had long been familiar with the days of working at sunrise and resting at sunset. They were also familiar with the world where the earth was beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. The sky could be sunny or hazy, windy or rainy, exposed to snow and ice, spring, summer, autumn, or winter. People had seen everything and were already used to it. However, no one had experienced and seen the blood sea hanging upside down in the sky. It looked like it would collapse and destroy the entire world at any time. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed to be the doomsday aura that only the devil hell had. Therefore, although nothing had happened for the time being, there were many people who were very disgusted by this blood sea phenomenon. The well-informed Fuyunji sent a report the next day. It clearly pointed out that after the appearance of the blood sea phenomenon, the number of people leaving the immortal city suddenly doubled. Of course, most of those who didn't want to stay in this strange place because of disgust, fear, or simply because they didn't want to stay in this strange place were rogue cultivators and mortals outside the true immortal alliance. In Zhengxianmeng, which occupied this prosperous city and had unparalleled strength, there was no such phenomenon of people fleeing. Most people stayed here. The rules in the huge immortal alliance were strict. It was a serious crime to leave rashly. At this special time, it was more likely that they would be charged with the crime of shaking people's hearts. If that happened, they would suffer in the future. Of course, there were people who left the immortal city in the immortal alliance. In fact, there were quite a number of them. However, everyone said that those who left had all kinds of special tasks. They were leaving the immortal city to do something outside the city and not fleeing. Although there were many women and children among the people who left, there were also some familiar people. Anyway, those who were really powerful and had a way to leave, or at least let their families leave first, even if there were strict rules in the immortal alliance. This had been the case since ancient times. Lu Chen and Old Ma stood in a secluded place at the top of Mount Celestial Dragon. They looked up at the surging sea of blood in the sky. As the strong wind blew in the sky, the blood-colored clouds rose and fell, looking like the rolling waves of the sea. It was a very spectacular scene, but it carried a dark red aura, which made people's hair stand on end. They were afraid that the endless sea of blood would fall on their heads in the next moment. Old Ma gasped as he looked at the scene and said, "What the hell is this? It's actually so terrifying. I'm afraid that even the evil devil cult didn't create such a disgusting thing." Lu Chen didn't agree with him. Instead, he thought about it carefully for a while and shook his head at Old Ma. "That's not it." Old Ma was startled and said, "Why? Have you seen something more powerful and more terrible than this before?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, in the Battle of the Barren Valley, the devil cult Yun Shou Yang and the other masters, including the southern barbarian fire shaman, opened a kind of god-subduing spell in the Barren Valley. At that time, the weather changed greatly, the sky broke, and there seemed to be evil gods descending in the violent wind and thunder. The scene at that time was much more terrible than it is now." Old Ma was a little surprised. He looked at Lu Chen with a somewhat complicated expression and said, "At that time, I was on the periphery and didn't enter the Barren Valley, so this is the first time I've heard of this." "Well, for so many years, why haven't I heard you mention it?" Lu Chen looked at him and smiled. "Even the dead Baldy knows about this." Have you heard him mention it to others? Old Ma immediately pursed his lips and shook his head without saying anything more. However, there was still an unconcealable doubt in his eyes. Obviously, he was puzzled by Lu Chen's sudden mention of this matter today. However, Lu Chen didn't seem to have any intention of clearing up his doubts. He glanced at the sky and said, "If I'm not wrong, this is probably just the beginning. More and more terrible things are yet to come." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said snappily, "You make it sound so easy." After a pause, he said gloomily, "I should have hidden in the Western continent and lived a carefree life. In the end, that errand was taken by Chen He. Now, I can't go, and he can't go either. Now, he's staying at home all day, looking like he's out of his wits. He looks quite pitiful." Lu Chen was silent for a moment and frowned slightly. It was unknown if he was thinking of the scene he saw at the door of the bedroom that night. Even with his heart of stone, a look of displeasure appeared on his face. After shaking his head slightly, he sighed and said, "Regardless of what kind of person Chen He is, his wife and child died unjustly. This matter is quite strange and treacherous. We have to investigate it carefully." Old Ma glanced at him and said, "So, that's why you made that promise to Chen He that day?" Lu Chen said lightly, "He should have trusted the dead Baldy more than me." After saying that, Lu Chen didn't seem to want to continue this topic. He changed the topic and said, "By the way, has White Lotus been looking for you recently? I feel like I haven't seen her for a while." Old Ma said, "No, I haven't seen her recently either. When I just came back a few days ago, I saw that she was in a bad mood. She was a little depressed. Since then, she has been locking herself in Su Qingjuan's house and rarely comes out." Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said, "This is rare. If it was in the past, she would have appeared long ago when such a big thing happened. Anyway, she has some friendship with us. Let's go and see her." Old Ma nodded and said, "Okay, she should still be living in Su Qingjuan's house. Let's go and see." After saying that, the two walked side by side in the direction of the house where Su Qingjun lived. Behind them, the blood clouds in the sky were rolling and the blood sea was surging. It seemed to be brewing to set off an even bigger wave. The blood sea phenomenon in the sky of the immortal city was overwhelming, but there didn't seem to be much change in the blood moon city below the immortal city. Even though the two looked very similar and were vaguely connected in countless ways, the blood moon city didn't seem to have changed much. What had changed in some details was that the mysterious aura that suppressed the cultivation of human cultivators in the blood moon city had become stronger recently. Ordinary cultivators who came here felt like they had entered hell. Their spiritual power was rolling in the opposite direction and it was very uncomfortable. So now, except for some necessary personnel, almost no one came to the Blood Moon City. Most of the time, it was empty, like an uninhabited ghost town. But in fact, there was still life here. There were no plants, no animals, but there were two people. Under the dry well in the backyard of the mansion, White Lotus, who was tied up with a rope and unable to move, was pale and curled up into a ball. There was a trace of pain on her face. It seemed that she was suffering the suppression of the omnipresent power here. But other than that, for some reason, there seemed to be a trace of secret pleasure in the depths of her eyes. Because not far from her, on the other side of the dry well, there was a figure who was suffering 10 times or 100 times more. His body was lying on the ground, his hands tearing at his skin and flesh. The ground was dripping with blood. Chapter 586. After an unknown amount of time, the masked man in the dry well finally calmed down. The pain that wreaked havoc in his body seemed to have temporarily forgiven him, quietly hiding in a dark corner. The man's breathing stabilized, and he stood up. After tidying up his clothes, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus. The mask was hideous and terrifying, flashing a strange luster, but because of this, the expression on the man's face could not be seen. White Lotus's body shrank slightly, and her face revealed a somewhat fearful expression. As for the little bit of joy in her eyes, it immediately disappeared after the masked man calmed down. Now, she was in a corner of the dry well, her body pressed against the stone wall, and her whole body curled up into a ball. She really looked like a young girl, ignorant and pure, and when she saw the strange man in front of her, she seemed to be very afraid. After a while, even the last bit of panting disappeared. The masked man seemed to let out a long breath, and then raised his eyes to look above. Bai Lian followed his gaze and looked in the same direction. She only saw the round hole above the well. There was nothing there except for the round blood-red sky. "Who are you?" the masked man asked White Lotus in a low and somewhat hoarse voice. White Lotus shrank her body, and then replied timidly, "I just told you, my name is White Lotus, and I am a disciple of the Kunlun party." During the gap between the masked man's words, White Lotus's eyebrows drooped, and she looked very afraid, just like an ignorant girl. But in fact, the corner of her eyes still quietly glanced in that direction, and at the same time, her mind was racing, trying to guess the identity of this person. This was an underground cave and a mysterious city. There was a blood moon anomaly above it, and the floating clouds office and the star hall were heavily guarded outside. It was obvious that this was a great secret. Ordinary people would not even know the specific details of the truth, let alone enter. White Lotus herself did not know the secret below, so she was curious, and secretly followed Lu Chen, Oxen, and Black Dog to sneak here. At this time, she more or less came to a realization. No wonder Lu Chen, Fuyunji, and Shuang did so many things, and searched so hard, and almost turned the immortal city upside down, but still could not find the whereabouts of Elder Ghost. If this person in front of her was indeed Elder Ghost, it would explain why Fuyunji returned without any results. Probably no one would have thought that Elder Ghost would actually be hiding under everyone's noses. However, looking at this person's appearance, especially the painful and even self-mutilating action just now, White Lotus had an idea in her heart. This Elder Ghost did not have an extremely terrifying hidden illness, or he was seriously affected by this underground world that was shrouded by the blood moon radiance. It was even possible that it was both. Elder Ghost seemed to have completely calmed down at this moment. Of course, the mask on his face covered his face, and it was impossible to see whether he was happy or sad. Only a pair of deep light could be seen in his eyes. He looked at White Lotus, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Just an ordinary Kunlun disciple." White Lotus did not speak, but her heart still slightly tightened. After a moment, she heard Elder Ghost say, "Why would an ordinary Kunlun disciple come here? There are many people guarding outside this cave, right? Also, when you were caught by me, that Taoist technique divine power, was it called snow wind scripture? That thing is not ordinary." White Lotus almost instantly made a decision in her heart, and then said, "I am a disciple of the Kunlun party. My master's Taoist name is Bai Chen, and he was the one who taught me the snow wind scripture. However, he has already passed away, and I have no one to rely on in this immortal city. As for why I came here, it's because I was too bored, so I followed that person named Lu Chen down here to have some fun. Senior, I really didn't mean to disturb you. Please spare me this time, please." At the end of her sentence, tears welled up in White Lotus's eyes, and she actually looked like she was really about to cry. However, in her heart, her thoughts were spinning rapidly, and she was thinking hard of a countermeasure. Although she was begging bitterly, but in reality, White Lotus's thoughts were very clear in her heart. It was fine if this person was not Elder Ghost, but if he really was Elder Ghost, then it was impossible for him to let her go. What if he let her go and snitched on her? Putting her life in the hands of a seemingly innocent and strange young girl. White Lotus herself did not believe this kind of thing, so she also did not believe that this devil sect's last great enemy, who had a terrible reputation and had been the enemy of the righteous faction Zhengxiameng for decades, would make this mistake. Yes, from White Lotus's point of view, the possibility of this monster that was neither human nor ghost being shameless and obscene, or even killing her, was far higher than the possibility of him being kind. Then right now, it was a hopeless situation where she had a slim chance of survival. She seemed to be unable to defeat this person. Then, was there still a chance of survival? Hearing White Lotus's pleading, Elder Ghost looked as expected indifferent, and did not even hesitate at this moment, but coldly looked at White Lotus, and said, Snow Wind's scripture is indeed a good thing, your teacher actually passed it down to you, seems like he values your talent very highly. White Lotus said, Yes, to tell the truth to senior, teacher only passed down the Snow Wind scripture to me alone, my other two senior brothers did not obtain this skill. When Elder Ghost heard till here, for the first time, he revealed a little astonishment, and then after a moment of silence, he looked at White Lotus, his voice awe-inspiring, and said, Didn't expect you to be such a lucky person, that Snow Wind scripture is a unique skill. Senior, you want it? I will pass it to you. White Lotus directly interrupted, her tone firm, her expression sincere, as if the person in front of her was not her enemy, but her great benefactor who had given her a second life. Elder Ghost paused for a moment, probably did not expect that the little girl in front of him would actually have this kind of attitude. The Snow Wind scripture, in the eyes of a person at his level, was of course an extremely precious treasure. As long as there was a chance, he would definitely want to take it for himself. But White Lotus's reaction was far from what he had originally expected. For a moment he did not know what to say, and only after a long while did he say, Isn't this your teacher's painstaking effort? You are the disciple of a Huashan true monarch, why don't you have the slightest thought of being loyal to him? A trace of sadness flashed across White Lotus's face, and then said, I have let senior see a joke. To tell the truth, ever since teacher passed away, I have been bullied and humiliated in the Kunlun party, especially my martial uncle Tian Lan. He was even cold-hearted towards me. As she said till here, she secretly glanced at Elder Ghost from the corner of her eye, and indeed saw that when Elder Ghost heard the name of true monarch Tian Lan, his body slightly shook, as if his attention was suddenly focused. White Lotus laughed coldly in her heart, for so many years being crushed and hunted down by true monarch Tian Lan. In terms of the person who had the greatest resentment towards true monarch Tian Lan, there was probably no one in the world who could be more resentful towards true monarch Tian Lan than this Elder Ghost. Whether there was a chance of survival, would depend on how deep this Elder Ghost's hatred towards true monarch Tian Lan was. Chapter 587. It had been a few days since the murder of women and children happened on Mount Sky Dragon. This incident had a great impact. It was said that even a few demigod true monarchs were paying attention to it. After all, this incident happened on Mount Sky Dragon, in the heart of Zhengxianmeng. To some extent, it was equivalent to slapping the faces of all the people in Zhengxianmeng. Fortunately, the devil cult had basically been defeated, and it was difficult for them to stir up trouble again. In this bloody incident, no one found any clues related to the devil cult at the scene. Otherwise, it would probably cause another uproar. 10 years ago, no, at most 5 years ago, or even shorter, the only sect in the world that dared to do such a terrible thing to the core of the true Immortal Alliance's sphere of influence was the devil cult, the evil sect. And according to the usual practice, after the devil cult did such a thing, they must leave a trace to prove their identity. This was equivalent to announcing to Zhengxianmeng and even the whole world that this earth-shattering event was done by them. Therefore, this time the scene was so clean. In fact, it also proved that the devil cult seemed to have nothing to do with this incident. This also made many people in Fuyunji heave a sigh of relief. After all, if one were to talk about the motive of the murder, the number one suspect who hated Chen He and his family to the bone would probably be the devil cult. As for those enemies in Zhengxianmeng because of the conflict of interests, it was unlikely that they would do such a thing. But now that the truth was in front of them, Chen He and his family were killed, Zhengxianmeng's face was completely lost, Fuyunji and even true monarch Tian Lan's faces were slapped. So many people, including the various forces in Zhengxianmeng and the big and small forces in the big immortal city, paid special attention to the movements of Fuyunji during this period of time. Was there any movement in Fuyunji? Of course there was. After such a big event, if there was no movement, then wouldn't they be no different from a stone man? From Shuang to the bottom of the Floating Clouds Division, the entire organization of the Floating Clouds Division seemed to have been mobilized. They started their investigation from the Heavenly Dragon Mountain and continued their pursuit. Their spies were everywhere, tracking down every single suspicious clue and suspicious person. As for whether or not this was of any use, outsiders had no idea. Everyone only knew that the terrifying murderer had yet to be caught. However, the Fuyan Agency's search efforts were getting stronger and stronger. The entire immortal city seemed to be restless because of them. It was just that the majority of people didn't dare to resist. After all, it was clear that the Fuyan Agency was truly anxious this time around. Regardless of whether it was the humiliation of being slapped in the face or the threat of the true monarch, who was at a higher level and had an awe-inspiring aura, they quickly turned into pressure on the people of the floating cloud service. Regardless of whether that murderer was dead or alive, they had to find him. The whole immortal city was solemn. It seemed like even the prosperity of the past had lost its color. Perhaps under the pressure of such a strong force, the people had become cautious and cautious. Since he was very young, he was basically a very cautious person. His parents died when he was young, and he had a younger brother who was even more immature to take care of. Along the way, he had really suffered a lot. When he was young, it was to eat his fill. When he was older, he entered the Kunlun party to climb up. Everything was for a better life, so that he could be more at ease. Yes, he had never been at ease. In the depths of his heart, he always felt that he would always be the child who pulled his young and immature younger brother and stood helplessly and hopelessly on the streets. He had no sense of security. He had nothing. He always felt that everything in his hands could be lost at any time. Everything now was like a child's naive and exaggerated dream. When he woke up, everything was empty, and he returned to that terrifying, lonely, and hopeless world. He had never spoken of this feeling to anyone, including his younger brother, Gang. Originally, everything seemed to be slowly getting better. He had become Dukanjinran's disciple, his cultivation had advanced, his reputation had risen, and his future was limitless. Everything would get better. But later, so many things happened one after another. His younger brother died, and he didn't know who the real killer was. His master also died, and the real killer was himself. Some paths had been taken wrongly, and it turned out that there was really no turning back. Every night, when it was dark and silent, when he was alone, he would think about the past, wondering if there was a second path he could choose. However, there was no medicine for regret in this world, even if it seemed that the choice he made was completely wrong. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not someone he could trust at all. Even though he had done so many things for this perfected lord, betraying his master whom he was indebted to and betraying the first half of his life, he was perhaps as insignificant as an ant in perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. He felt that he was about to lose everything. He was extremely afraid of this. Even if everyone in the world thought that he was strong and powerful, he knew that he was weak and timid inside. He could never let himself be in a situation where he had no one to rely on again. It was Tianlan who had betrayed him first. Everything he had done was just to let himself live better, or even just to survive. He did not believe that after Lu Chen became the master, he would still tolerate him. After all, he had personally thrown him into the Longchuan River. He even felt that with true Lord Tianlan's ruthlessness, in order to pave the way for his disciple, he would probably die a violent death before Lu Chen became the master. This must never happen. Therefore, when the sea of blood hung in the sky, he passed through the underground passage and came to the small building again. He told himself again that everything he had done was not wrong. It was Lu Chen who was wrong, Tianlan who was wrong, and the whole world who was wrong. However, he could not forget the bloody scene that night. The cries and screams in the dark still seemed to echo in his ears. He shook his head and looked at the door that appeared in front of him in a daze. Then he pushed the door open and walked in. Just like the last time he came here, this door looked like a very warm and gentle bedroom, as if a young girl was living her best years here. The beautiful figure was sitting in front of the dressing table. Hearing the sound, she turned around and saw it was him. She immediately smiled sweetly, like a beautiful spring flower blooming. Farther behind her, on the bed, on the edge of the soft red quilt, sat another old man. He had white hair and snow-white eyebrows. Although some age spots could be seen on the exposed skin on his face and hands, he was still intimidating and awe-inspiring. Although he was not as high and mighty as true Lord Tianlan, he also had a kind of insufferably powerful aura. He Yi's eyes lit up and he quickly stepped forward. He first cupped his fists, but after a moment of hesitation, he suddenly knelt down on both knees and kowtowed in front of the old man. The old man raised his white eyebrows and smiled. He said, "Ah, why do you do this?" He lowered his head and said in a sincere tone, "Disciple He has been fascinated by Lord True Lord for a long time. Seeing you today, I am even more convinced. All the things in the past were just because I didn't see a wise master. If Lord True Lord doesn't abandon me, disciple is willing to die for Lord True Lord." The old man laughed and said, "You call me disciple the moment we meet. I don't remember having a master-disciple relationship with you." He Yi's body trembled and his eyes turned sharply. Then he said with great joy, "If I have the honor, He Yi is willing to be Lord True Lord's disciple and I will die for you." The beautiful woman, Song Wenji, stood at the side and watched this scene. She smiled faintly, but a complicated expression flashed across the depths of her eyes. There was a tinge of coldness and a hint of mockery. She turned to look out of the window and saw that the sky was oppressive and the sea of blood was surging. She thought to herself that this filthy world would rather the end of the world come sooner. Chapter 588. Lu Chen and Old Ma called outside the room where Su Qingjun used to live for a long time, but there was no movement in the room. The doors and windows were closed tightly. Looking at the situation, it was obvious that either the person in the room did not want to see them at all, or there was no one in the room at all. The two looked at each other, and their faces were a little ugly, because this was not the first time they came to find White Lotus but did not get any results. From their conversation that day, they remembered that they had not seen White Lotus for a long time. This was the third time they came here, but every time they came, the door was closed. If it happened once or twice, it could be said that it was a coincidence that White Lotus did not go out, but they did not see her 3 times in a row. Moreover, Lu Chen and Old Ma were both careful people, and they had secretly inquired before. These days, no one in Fuyunji had ever seen White Lotus. So, either White Lotus did not go out at all these days and locked herself inexplicably in the room as if she was meditating, or something happened that they did not know. Old Ma looked at Lu Chen and whispered, "Something is wrong." Lu Chen nodded, and at the same time, he also understood the meaning in Old Ma's words that was not clear, but very obvious. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "Let's go in and have a look." The door was tightly shut and locked, but this was just an ordinary house. It was not the kind of immortal's cave that was protected by a powerful magic circle or a powerful mechanism. For the two of them who had been in the dark world for so many years, there was not much difference between having a barrier and not having a barrier. Old Ma nodded, walked over, stood in front of the door, and used his body to block his hands. At the same time, Lu Chen walked behind him calmly and naturally, with his back to Old Ma, facing the road outside and glancing around. In order to meet White Lotus, they had purposely chosen a night when they were most likely to be at home. Therefore, there was no one on the road outside. Old Ma stood still, and because his body was blocking the view, they couldn't see what he was doing. But after a while, they heard a muffled sound, and then there was a clatter behind the door, as if something had fallen to the ground. Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and pushed the door with his hand. The door creaked open. A cool breeze blew past them. Lu Chen and Old Ma both frowned and walked in. The room was still a little dark, but everything was laid out before them, and, looking round, they had their answer. "There's no one in this house," Old Ma said in a deep voice. Lu Chen walked to the side of the table, touched the surface of the table, glanced at it, and said lightly, "No one has cleaned here for a few days." Old Ma looked around and said, "The furniture is good and neatly arranged. No one has done anything here." Lu Chen nodded, and after a moment of silence, said, "She left here by herself and never came back." The two looked at each other, and then fell silent. Because of the strange blood sea anomaly in the sky, the scenery in Immortal City and Mount Celestial Dragon had become very strange. During the day, the light was blocked by the blood sea in the sky, so many places were very dark, but in the middle of the night, when everything was quiet and dark, many places were brighter than usual because of the strange dark red light emitted by the blood sea anomaly in the sky. Lu Chen and Old Ma walked on the road. The dark red light shone on them, and even their faces seemed to be a little red. Usually at this time, the road should be dark, but now they could see the surrounding scenery clearly. However, everything was smeared with a layer of red, and it looked a little frightening. After walking for a while, Lu Chen suddenly said, "You go back first, I'll go to Kunlun Temple." Old Ma was shocked, and his mind turned. After a moment, he frowned and said in a deep voice, "What do you want to do?" Lu Chen said, "White Lotus has a special identity. Although she is usually not favored by that damn Baldi, as long as Fuyunji and that damn Baldi don't fall, and she doesn't provoke those soul-severing old men, no one in Zhengxianmeng will dare to touch her. The only one who has that idea." At this point, Lu Chen stopped and didn't continue, but Old Ma already understood what he meant, and his frown deepened. He looked at Lu Chen and said, "What you said may be right, but what do you mean by going to immortal like this? Do you want to question him for White Lotus?" He snorted and said, "Don't blame me for scolding you. I can't see that you have such deep feelings for her." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but he shook his head and said, "You're wrong. I don't think it was done by that damn Baldi. It's just that she is the person chosen by that damn Baldi, so I must go and confirm with him. If even that damn Baldi doesn't know something happened to White Lotus, then this matter must be carefully investigated." Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and then he nodded. It was true. White Lotus was the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. Although she was not loved by the current immortal Tianlan because of the conflict between the factions in the sect, she was still his niece in name. Because of this, immortal Tianlan absolutely couldn't let anything happen to her. Although it was somewhat ironic, White Lotus was more like a memorial arch now. Immortal Tianlan could push down and destroy it whenever he wanted, but it was absolutely impossible for others to do it. Old Ma left first, and Lu Chen turned in the direction of the Kunlun Temple. At the same time, he began to recall the appearance of that girl, White Lotus. To be honest, White Lotus was a very unique existence out of all the women he knew. She and Lu Chen had always been in a state where it was difficult to tell who was friend or foe. The relationship between the two of them was also very ambiguous. There were even a few times when they had fought, and they had dealt fatal blows. Of course, Lu Chen didn't have any romantic feelings for this beautiful but unusually fierce girl. At least, he didn't think about it in that way at all. But for some reason, after discovering the abnormality of White Lotus, he almost immediately decided to investigate it without thinking. What was the reason? Could it be that the girl was beautiful after all? Would someone born with a beautiful and exquisite face have such a huge advantage over an ugly person? Lu Chen couldn't help laughing in his heart and put these boring thoughts aside. He thought that he should still be indifferent to White Lotus, at least now he was not nervous at all. In this way, he walked to the front of the Kunlun Temple. After reporting, although it was late at night, the Order of Immortal Tianlan quickly came out and asked him to go in. From this, it could be seen that Lu Chen indeed had a special position in Immortal Tianlan's heart. When Lu Chen walked to the Kunlun Temple, he saw Immortal Tianlan sitting in the hall thoughtfully. Although it was late at night, it seemed that this bald immortal was still not sleepy at all. Without beating around the bush, Lu Chen directly walked over and sat beside him. Then he said, "White Lotus is missing. I can't find her." The expression on Immortal Tianlan's face didn't seem to change. He just raised his head and glanced at him. Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "Did you want to kill her?"